Welcome to VOICES 2020, the Business of Fashion's annual gathering for big thinkers. And welcome to Westbourne Grove in West London. I've lived around here for the past 2 decades. Just around the corner, I started writing the business of fashion from my sofa back in 2007. Just like in the movie, the Notting Hill of 1999 was filled with vintage stores and stalls. That gradually made way for a global village of contemporary brands from France, international lifestyle stores, and destination brunch spots. This has always been a really vibrant and interesting place to live, but I've never seen it change so much as I have in the past 9 months. When COVID-19 suddenly shut everything down, I started taking daily walks and documenting the retail transformation happening all around me. Over the summer, restaurants and shops that have been here for decades suddenly disappeared. Matches Fashion closed its 3 Notting Hill boutiques. Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop store shut down, and so did Reformation, All Saints, and many more. Then, almost as rapidly, a whole series of new retail concepts and restaurants opened up, from greengrocers and CBD purveyors, fashion outlet stores shedding inventory. There was a retail transformation happening right before my eyes. By the time September rolled around, it became clear that we would not be able to hold Voices at our regular venue at Soho Farmhouse in Oxfordshire. So we thought, why not a pop-up Voices studio? So here we are on Westbourne Grove, right in the future of retail, the heart of one of the most important stories in the fashion industry this year. And throughout VOICES 2020, we'll be broadcasting from here, our COVID-secure studio. We'll have some speakers joining us virtually and a handful of in-person conversations. And we've been working on some pre-recorded talks, especially for this event over the last few weeks. The current shooting rules here in the UK allow for professional filming as long as social distancing measures are in place. And as you can see, we have done everything possible to make our studio as COVID secure as we can. All of our backstage team members are staying at least 1 meter apart and are wearing masks. And anyone joining us on set will be adhering to the 2-meter rule. Are you ready? VOICES 2020 is about to start.
My money and my existence is as valid as yours.
The way we're taught to live has got to change.
What is glamorous about living in a dying world?
Like, you might have never been to a runway show of a black designer that's not Kanye West, right?
You're talking about the state of the world. It's not God's fault, it's our fucking fault, all right?
Back in 2016, long before the coronavirus rocked our world, disrupted the industry we work in, and changed our lives every single day, the business of fashion created Voices to help us understand how forces in the wider world are shaping the fashion industry. Now in its 5th year, VOF Voices gathers the industry's most consequential leaders and the world's most provocative thinkers and activists to explore the most important issues of our times.
How is it possible that a garment is cheaper than a sandwich?
It's amazing that, we've started a conversation, we've opened up the concept that the people in power in the fashion industry can make change.
We were afraid to try something new, and by new they meant we've never shot a black girl.
My beauty is so tremendous that they try to confine it, but my beauty you can still peek through and see it.
It is incumbent upon us to hold ourselves accountable, to hold our world leaders accountable.
What does it mean that the majority of our clothes are produced in Southeast Asia by people who look like me, and yet the majority of it is consumed here in the West?
It is up to you if Trump, or if Brexit, or if the alt-right either become Crocs or become Chanel of our political age.
Facebook and Instagram are these safe spaces for your brands to be appearing.
These conversations are more important now than ever before. So welcome to the Voices studio. Most of the time, I'll be sitting here at my desk working with our excellent team, many of whom are off-site today to make everything happen as planned. These past few months have been very busy, and the dedication the BOF team has shown has been really inspiring. Ultimately, it's thanks to them that we've been able to bring Voices 2020 to fruition. Throughout the event, we'll be testing different types of content, multimedia formats, and technology to see what's working best. We've had to adapt fast, and we are using Voices 2020 as a learning experience. So please bear with us if there are any issues, and do share your feedback with us in the survey you'll receive at the end of the event. But there's one thing that hasn't changed this year. Voices still represents everything the business of fashion stands for. It's the manifestation of the soul of our business. It's where we bring together our incredible global community to share in common experiences. It's where we gain insights and learnings from the world's foremost leaders, thinkers, activists, and experts. These are the people shaping the society and culture we live in, far beyond the silos of the fashion industry. And this is why I felt it was so important to find at least some way to manifest this year's Voices in a kind of physical form. The energy of the collisions and conversations that happen at Voices are so unique. In his documentary on American history, Oliver Stone says, "Real history is the story of lots of things happening at the same time." Well, the current crisis is the collision of three seismic events: a once-in-a-century public health emergency, a once-in-a-generation economic crisis, and a racial and inequality reckoning centuries in the making. This is history. 2020 has been insane. But could there be a more pivotal year than 2021? A massive global vaccine distribution operation will be unleashed. Big technology companies will be navigating antitrust investigations in Europe, the United States, and China. A new American presidency is on the horizon. And many of us will finally begin to venture back into the real world more than a year after we've been confined to our homes. What will it feel like? What will the world and the fashion industry be like after this is all over? And most importantly, how do we engender the change we want to see in the world? Well, our Voices 2020 speakers will help us answer all of these questions. Over the next few days, we'll take you on a journey designed to inspire and teach you, and also take you outside your comfort zone. There are some hard truths to face, but there are also some amazing people to meet. This year's event features 55 singular voices in global business, academia, society, technology, philanthropy, and culture. From 16-year-old food activist Christina Adane to 81-year-old academic rock star Carlota Perez. We also have an Olympic gold medalist, doctors in the fields of neuroscience and economics, Silicon Valley disruptors, and of course, some of the most inspiring and creative business leaders from the fashion industry. Today, in our session on the wider world, we're going to take a step back and think about the gravity of what we're living through and what we need to do to get through the next phase of this crisis. Tomorrow, we'll delve inside the fashion system by holding up a mirror to our industry. We'll examine the changes we need to make and reimagine what's possible, while considering exciting opportunities that a new perspective might bring. Later on Wednesday, we'll dive into the world of technology and innovation, where we'll meet a group of daring entrepreneurs, scientists, technologists, and innovators from inside and outside fashion. They'll explain how technology is radically changing the world around us. And then on Thursday, we'll go deep into the future of retail as the industry grapples with a consumer landscape forever changed by the events of the last year. And finally, as always, we'll encourage you to live your best life. We'll meet some health and wellness experts, plus people whose own amazing personal journeys will help us understand how we can be the most healthy and fulfilled versions of ourselves. Now, Voices wouldn't be possible without our partners, and I'd like to express our gratitude to McKinsey & Company, Affirm, SCAD, and the Invisible Collection for their collaboration this year. Tomorrow, during our session called The Wider World, we'll feature the findings from our annual report with McKinsey, The State of Fashion 2021. But throughout this event, the most important voices are yours. Since the beginning of the pandemic, our connection with you, our BOF professionals, has been a vital source of energy and inspiration for our team. Through the countless emails and messages of support you've sent and the feedback you've shared on social media, we're truly grateful for your support. And in return, we work hard every day to create products and experiences that are valuable and distinctive in a crowded fashion media landscape. Today, we have more than 10,000 BOF professional members registered to attend, and that makes this by far the biggest Voices event ever, and certainly the most global fashion conference the industry has ever seen. So, what's been on your minds? Well, as we come to the end of the toughest year for the global fashion industry, we're also sharing the results from our first ever Global BOF Community Exit Poll. We asked you who you are, how you're feeling, and what you're up to right now. So let me tell you a little bit about you. Well, you come from 106 countries across 6 continents. You're a balanced mix of creative and business professionals, and many of you identify as both. You're well represented across generational cohorts, and our exit poll tells us more. It goes without saying that the pandemic has dramatically impacted the way you live and work. In fact, 38% of you were physically displaced at some point during the pandemic. A whopping 57% of you are still not going into an office. And even more, 63% haven't been into a retail store in the past 7 days. And that's people who work in fashion. Over half of you, 56%, talked to someone about your stress levels in the last 7 days. And though only 25% of you believe that the fashion industry will become much better next year, the majority of you remain optimistic about the ability of your companies to navigate the crisis. We want to hear from all of you over the next few days, as your voices are an important part of this conversation. So remember, throughout Voices 2020, you can ask questions of our speakers and join the global conversation using the hashtag BOFVoices. Join me very soon for our first keynote interview. It's with writer and science journalist Laura Spinney. Stay where you are.
Very good, very good. Strong start, Imran.
Thank you. Now, the worst pandemic in modern history was back in 1918. The Spanish flu killed an estimated 50 million people. Laura Spinney is a writer and science journalist. Her nonfiction bestseller, Pale Rider, The Spanish Flu of 1918 and How It Changed the World, has been published in 15 languages. Her scientific writing has also appeared in The Guardian, The Economist, Nature, and National Geographic. She lives in Paris, from where she's joining us this afternoon. Hello, Laura. It's great to have you with us for Voices 2020.
Hi, Imran. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm speaking to you from Paris, from a sort of semi-lockdown, and that seems appropriate since I want to tell you all about this pandemic that happened a little over 100 years ago. So maybe we can go straight to my first slide.
Yes, we'd like to start with an overview of the Spanish flu pandemic, and it would be great to just hear any learnings that might be relevant to the current pandemic and the situation we're living through.
Sure. Okay. So let me take you to Egon Schiele, if I can. My first slide. Thank you very much. So this is a painting by Egon Schiele, the Austrian artist. It's one of the last he did. It's usually known by the title The Family. And Egon Schiele painted it in 1918. He died that autumn of the so-called Spanish flu, and so did his wife Edith, who was pregnant with their first child. So that family was wiped out, as were many millions of families across the globe. And for me, therefore, that painting distills the tragedy of 1918. But first, let me throw some facts at you about that pandemic. It killed an estimated 50 million people, though the numbers are vague, and it's possible that twice that many died. Around 2.5% of the global population is the equivalent of 50 million people at that time. 1 in 3 people on Earth were infected. And to put those numbers in perspective, as I think this slide nicely does, the First World War, with which that pandemic overlapped, killed an estimated 18 million people. The Second World War killed somewhere between 50 and 60 million people. And so the Spanish flu killed probably more than either of those, and possibly more than both put together. This graphic shows it pretty much as the worst disaster of the 20th century. It certainly was. And if you can see that little green dot there, that shows COVID-19 by comparison. To date, COVID-19 has killed an estimated 1.4 million people globally, though that's probably an underestimate. And of course, the pandemic hasn't finished yet, but you can see it in comparison to the Spanish flu there. Just to put that in numbers, by the way, in perspective in a different way, everybody who's listening here today has at least one ancestor who died of the Spanish flu on average. So I think that will give you an indication of just how great its impact was. This map is not perfectly accurate, but I show it because I want to give you a sense of how it really was really a global pandemic. There was hardly anywhere on Earth that was spared, although there were places, for example, St. Helens, the island in the Atlantic Ocean. It was called the Spanish flu, but it wasn't particularly Spanish, though Spain was affected like many other countries. The reason it was called that was because the world being at war at the time, many warring nations censored their press, but Spain was neutral in that war. So it didn't censor its press. And when the first cases occurred in that country in the spring of 1918, they were reported in the Spanish newspapers. So the Spanish, along with almost everybody else in the world, had the impression that this disease was rolling out from Madrid. In fact, we don't know even today where that pandemic started. There are 3 theories corresponding to origins in China, in the United States, in Kansas, and at a British military camp in northern France. The pandemic struck in 3 waves. Respiratory diseases seem to do that. They come in waves. The first was relatively mild, not that much different from a seasonal flu. The second returned with a vengeance in late August 1918. And in fact, the vast majority of deaths occurred in a mere 13 weeks, 1-3, between the middle of September and the middle of December 1918. And then there was a third wave that was intermediate in severity between the other 2 in the early months of 1919. So as you all certainly know, flu is a viral disease, but virus was a relatively new concept in 1918. And most doctors in the world thought they were dealing with a bacterial disease. So they had no reliable test for it. They had no effective treatments. Antivirals didn't come into the clinic until the 1960s. Antibiotics weren't invented until after the Second World War. And though flu is a viral disease, they might have helped with the bacterial complications that killed most patients through pneumonia, and they had no vaccine. So what's interesting is that they had to fall back on the same social distancing measures that we have had to rely on today, up to now anyway, with COVID-19. So although so its mortality was not even across the globe, and nor was it even across time, by which I mean it wasn't even across age groups either. This graph shows, I'm going to just describe it very quickly. The yellow curve shows the kind of age spread of people who died from flu in the previous 7 years. So you see the very young and the very old were vulnerable. The red curve shows those who died from the Spanish flu. And you can see there's this extra middle peak in the middle age group of those aged between 20 and 40. And that's why I've put Egon Schiele's painting there again, because he died aged 28. And that was the peak age for death in that middle group. It's interesting because although there were no lockdowns, we've never done lockdowns before in the way we mean it now, before COVID-19. There were public health measures imposed in various countries at that time. And what's interesting is that they tended to hit the same group as were most vulnerable to the disease, those in the productive age group, aged 20 to 40. Whereas now, of course, in COVID-18, the people we're trying to protect tend to be the elderly, and the people who are feeling the bite from the economic measures, the lockdowns and so on, tend to be much younger. So there's a discrepancy there, which is potentially causing some tensions. And I just wanted to end with this picture, because there are very few photos, in fact, associated with the 1918 pandemic. And the ones we usually see tend to show white Caucasian males. They're usually American soldiers, and that's no offense to Americans, but Americans happen to be very good photographers at the time. So the most photographs of that disaster tend to show American soldiers. But as I said, mortality was variable across space, and the poorest in the world tend to be hit the hardest. So that meant the poorest countries, but also the poorest in Western societies, which were the wealthiest at the time. If you lived in parts of Asia, you were more than 30 times more likely to die of the Spanish flu than if you lived in parts of Europe. So I want to show this picture. I like to show this picture of Japanese schoolgirls in the second wave of the pandemic in their country, wearing masks, as you see, because I think it illustrates that point of the burden of death hitting the poorer continents in the world in 1918, and probably again today. And also because it hints at the longer term consequences that pandemics can have, because it was in 1918 that Japanese people started wearing masks routinely to protect others from their own germs. So with that, I will stop and hand back to you. Thank you, Imran.
Thank you so much for that overview, Laura. We're going to take some questions from the BOF community in the moment. So if you have a question and you're watching, please go ahead and type it into the chat window next to the video player. And while we wait, I have a couple of questions of my own. First things first, Laura, I want to ask the question that's on everyone's minds, which is how much longer is the current pandemic going to last? I know it's hard to answer, but everyone just wants to know when this is all going to be over. What's your expert opinion?
Of course, that's what they want to know. It's perfectly understandable. And it is difficult to answer because partly it depends on how we respond. But let's say that 1918, in most parts of the world, it was staggered in time across the world, but in each part of the world that it hit, it didn't last more than 18 months, 2 years. Because essentially what happens is that the virus evolves to become more benign and to live more harmoniously with its human host. So it becomes a normally circulating and less vicious virus after a while. We could cut that short, though, with the vaccine, because it's looking like we will have an effective vaccine. We don't know yet, and there's more trials to be done and more data to come in, but we could have an effective vaccine rolling out to at least the most vulnerable people in the world within months. And that could potentially shorten the pandemic and bring an end to our misery sooner.
Well, let's talk about the vaccine for a minute, or the vaccines, as it were. There are now 3 vaccines that have released their kind of initial results from phase 3 trials: AstraZeneca, Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna. What can we expect now with the distribution and rollout of these vaccines? And if you were able to take a vaccine today, would you take one?
So as I said, we need more data. The trials aren't finished. I know that Moderna at least has applied for emergency use approval already. So these things could go very, very fast. Of course, we mustn't forget also the Russian and the Chinese vaccines. We have not seen any data for either of those, but they are already being rolled out. And the best we can say is that we don't know how effective they are yet. That information will hopefully come in slowly as well. But there's more work to do. I think it could go fast. You know, the pandemic is still raging, which has one, you know, it's a terrible thing, but there is a silver lining in the sense that you can find the people to test the vaccine against. Would I take it? That depends on the data. That depends on it being shown to be safe and effective. I think the procedures are in place. If they're properly applied, and I have no reason to believe they won't be, then when that is determined by the powers that be and the agencies that do these things, then I will happily take one.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's been a lot of discussion all around the world about how our institutions, you know, the science world, governments, pharma companies, the World Health Organization, how these institutions are managing this pandemic. What's your assessment, you know, from your vantage point about, you know, how we're managing this pandemic, given the learnings that we have from previous pandemics?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think we have seen a great variability in national responses. We've seen efforts also of people, of nations, and for example, US states to band together and try to respond in a coordinated way. Sometimes that's worked, sometimes it hasn't. Of course, it's difficult to say what's the right response about a virus that we don't understand. I mean, we're gathering information about it at an extraordinary rate, but to begin with, at least we knew very little about it. So there's a lot of uncertainty. Scientists are working very hard to understand it, and of course that will shape our response. I think the really important thing is that after 1918, there was a clear realization that a global crisis like a pandemic requires a global response. And there had been previous efforts to try and coordinate national responses to health crises in a series of conferences throughout the 19th century. But it was only after 1918 that you saw organizations being created, for example, the health branch of the League of Nations, that were dedicated to public health on a global stage. And those organizations are the predecessors of the WHO, which came to be after the Second World War. And the sad thing about that, in my eyes, is that we have, over the last few years, last few decades, as the world has become sort of politically more polarized, think of the US-China trade war, we have sapped the WHO of powers and resources. You saw the Donald Trump threatened to the funding from it. And so I think, I suspect that this pandemic will make us realize again that we need a global organization to coordinate a global response. It may not be the WHO. The WHO is not perfect, but we need something in its place.
I have one question that's come in from Stephen Healy, and he says, considering all respiratory illnesses come in waves of 3, does it seem likely that we'll have a third wave of COVID-19?
Okay, so when I said they come in waves, they do seem to. That's not completely understood. The number of waves is not necessarily fixed. Okay, in fact, interestingly, in 1918, there are some people who argue there were only 2 waves, and the third wave was a sort of relapse after the end of year holidays, Christmas, Hanukkah, and so on, when people's behavior patterns changed. For example, children weren't going to school anymore and mixing and spreading the virus. So that's both an indication of the fact that we shape the waves, but also the number of the waves is not fixed in advance. But yes, again, we are seeing that respiratory diseases come in waves. I think there's a really interesting calculation probably going on inside governments at the moment where they're saying, how do we juggle the exit from these current lockdowns in order to avoid another wave, a third wave in many cases, before the vaccine comes online? Because that's the last thing we want. We want to make sure we come out of this lockdown very carefully so that we keep the infection rates low until the vaccine can be rolled out properly. I think a lot of people are thinking about that right now.
Got it. Okay. How do you explain, we have a question from Emmanuelle. She says, how do you explain some places were less impacted than others? For example, the media thought that Africa would be, dramatically impacted by the virus. Countries like India have had, they've experienced a pandemic, but not in proportion to their population.
Yeah, excellent question. So, I mean, it has been a big mystery, and we probably won't have all the information and all the facts for a while. There's an element, certainly, of underreporting, that different countries are reporting illnesses and deaths differently, according to their resources to some extent. But one thing seems relatively clear. It's not that Africa, for example, had a different set of strains or different forms of the disease from anywhere else. No. Originally, they got their strains imported from Europe, from America, from every other continent on Earth. So they've got the same forms of the disease as us. But there could be other factors in play. For example, the African population is on average much younger than the European and American populations. And we know that the elderly are vulnerable in this disease. So that's one factor. Could be a climate factor, could be cultural forces shaping it. And there could be things like, for example, the interaction of different diseases. For example, we don't know what people who are receiving medication for AIDS, which is obviously a big problem on the African continent, how that treatment and the disease itself interacts with COVID-19, if it does. So there are all sorts of complicated factors playing into this, which we haven't untangled yet.
Well, Laura, thank you so much for your time today and for that masterclass in pandemics. I hope that the vaccines, as we've seen them, will be out soon, and that will bring us hopefully to the endemic. Thank you. So next up, we move to the global economy, and we examine the financial consequences of the coronavirus and the potential impact of a Biden presidency. We'll also consider the rise of China, the nation now expected to pave the way in a return to GDP growth as early as this quarter. Join us shortly as a panel of global experts in business and economics walk us through what we've seen in 2020 and what we can expect in 2021. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Voices 2020 for our session on the global economy. I'm delighted to introduce our lineup of experts. In New York, we have Felix Salmon, who is the award-winning chief financial correspondent of Axios and host of the weekly Slate Money podcast. In London, we have Dr. Dambisa Moyo, an expert in macroeconomics and geopolitics, who serves on a number of global corporate boards, including 3M Corporation, Chevron, and Condé Nast. And in Beijing, China, we're joined by Kai-Fu Lee, Chairman and Chief Executive of Sinovation Ventures, previously President of Google China. Thank you all for joining us today at Voices 2020. Over to you, Felix.
Thanks, Imran. This is exciting and incredibly international. I don't think I've ever done an event which has spanned so many time zones, which is apropos, I suppose, because the main thing that you and I and everyone wants to talk about right now is this idea of how the world has split apart and has fractured into two, possibly even more than two main groups. You have China on the one hand is growing basically above capacity, is doing incredibly well, is being incredibly inventive and innovative, and really sort of showing the way for the rest of the world about how to move forwards in manufacturing, in healthcare, in AI, you name it, in social media. And then the rest of the world, Dambisa, is kind of just imploding, right? This pandemic has hit us unbelievably hard. Give us a quick sort of tour of the horizon. How is everyone who isn't China faring right now?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Imran, Business of Fashion. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be on a panel with Kai-Fu and Felix, who I really like a lot and have known for a number of years. So I think what's really important to understand is that even before COVID hit in 2020, the global economy was already in a pretty precarious place. You will recall that we have been really grappling as the global economy has continued to try and emerge from the 2008 financial crisis. And maybe just in terms of a quick perspective around the key aspects that are quite worrisome, I would say that there are three things. One is global growth was slow, and it is slow again because we've had an aggregate demand shock. In other words, we're all sitting at home, not in the stores. And that means that global growth is far below the 3% per year number that you need in order to double per capita incomes in a generation. So real contraction. In fact, every single large economy has suffered from a recession in 2020, excluding China, which Kai-Fu will definitely give us a perspective on. The second big issue that we've been struggling with, certainly as economists, but also people involved in business, is that public policy is largely impotent. By that, I mean, we really needed government to throw a ton of money at the problem, which they did post 2008 financial crisis, and they've been doing even now, but it's basically leaving the public policy environment in a very, very dangerous place. A lot of debt and a lot of sort of new challenges around negative interest rates. I won't get into the technicalities of that, but it is worth noting that right now in the United States, about 20% of American companies are considered zombies. By that, I mean they have so much debt on their balance sheets that they're not even able to use their cash flows to pay their workers and to pay down their debt. So very risky place. And then the final thing you touched on is really about the trends of deglobalization. We are seeing a contraction in global trade, contraction in investment, in capital flows, in the movement of people, really a diminution of international integration, international engagement, as institutions such as the World Bank and IMF are really challenged by Chinese rivals. And that whole world of being interactive and trade and capital flows, etc., has been incredibly challenged over the past 10 years. And obviously with COVID, it's even become more challenging in terms of supply chains and how we interact with each other. To very much conclude, in looking forward, what does this tell us? What does this portend for the next decade? And really the news, to my mind, is not good. The macroeconomic forecasts are pointing right now to certainly a rebound, in the sense that we are all going to be out, hopefully with the vaccine. And we're just talking about the OECD numbers. There is a story there, which is that we'll get a vaccine and we'll all be able to go out and see our friends and eat in restaurants. And that will obviously reverberate in the economy and should be a good sort of push for demand. The challenge, though, is that all the things that I talked about earlier, the debts, the issues around climate change, income inequality, massive demographic shifts, etc., are things that we have not yet got our arms around. And in a world where public policy has got a lot of debt, it's going to be much harder to address. So let me stop there. I know that sounds very bearish, but I will say
it's terrifying.
Well, the truth is we've been in this situation before. Post the 1929 crash, we had 25 years of an economic malaise, high unemployment, and low growth. And I will just say
that's not reassuring, Dambisa.
But we'll get to it, because I was just going to conclude by saying, that people are going to make fortunes, businesses are going to survive. So we will come to what do you do in this type of an environment. But, suffice it to say, it is an incredibly challenged environment. And I think it will continue to be so in the next several years.
So, Kai-Fu, I want to bring you in here because you are living in this sort of world of plenty and growth and innovation. Give us a quick overview of how someone in China takes what Dambisa has just said and says, wait, how do I square this? How do I think about that? And how it looks from your perspective.
Okay, sure. Thanks for inviting me to this great conference. So I've been working in China for a long time, and China, as you know, has had a pretty successful recovery from COVID. And a lot of that is due to the pretty strong measures, including contact tracing and things like that, and very strong quarantine. And now I think China's re-emerging. And after 1 or 2 months of very difficult time early in the year, February, March, and everything's been going up. And factories are running, not even at full capacity, but everybody's back at work. Our investments we're making more than ever. All aspects of the economy, especially healthcare, education, as infused by technology, AI and video conferencing, and everything's going digital. So everything's going extremely well. Probably only offline retail restaurants are maybe down a little, but everything else has been very much booming. And a lot of this has a lot to do with China being very innovative with digital technologies, beginning with the most advanced forms of social network, such as TikTok, payment, such as Alipay, and financial, and WeChat Pay. And that has formed the foundation that really closed the loop in China's commerce. And to give you an example, you're all in the fashion industry. So you are used to the traditional way, classical way of design, product development, manufacturing, supply chain, retail, online and offline, marketing, sales, fulfillment, being separate things that are aggregated. What we're seeing in China is all of these are being coalesced into one closed loop. And that's truly phenomenal. And that began with people's ability to pay by mobile payment. Once you can pay by mobile payment, you can view a TV show, or rather a live stream e-commerce show. And your favorite a celebrity or KOL is talking about all of his or her favorite products, and you just click to buy. So that original promise of the interactive TV is live and well. China, believe it or not, has moved $200 billion worth of merchandise by this method of KOL celebrity live streaming. And also e-commerce actually is having a very tough time. You can see Alibaba stock is not doing that well because e-commerce is being disintermediated. Social networks are catching people in front of it, getting people for the impulse buy. The live streaming e-commerce is taking some of the traffic. And then there are also smaller KOLs who are helped by these full supply chain companies that does everything. All you have to do is get followers, then send out tweets, and then collect money. So 300,000 small retailers, small KOLs, they're augmenting their income by 20%. But let me conclude by telling you the most amazing thing that I have seen. In the last 3.5 years, there emerged a soft drink company. It is now worth $2 billion. This is, and they're the most popular thing in China. The entrepreneur is someone who came from a digital, internet, and gaming background. What he has done is, rather than building the product and figure out how to market and sell it, he first figures out how to market and sell it. And then he builds the product that will market and sell the best. In other words, he creates these internet content and advertising, and he tries out different celebrities, different channels, different audiences, different brands, different colors, different types of drink, different names of drinks, diet drink, non-diet drink, with milk, without milk. He tries them all, and then he comes to a conclusion: the single drink that will sell the best is X. And it should taste like this, look like this, with this color, sold this way to this people. Then he asks the product people, go make me 1 million bottles of those. And then he goes and produces the product. Because China's power in supply chain, he can do that within weeks. And then within weeks, he can predict how much of it he's going to sell. So this completely turns around the idea of build a product and market, sell it. He markets the product first, then he figures out what to build. So this also, finally, I think points out how strong China's supply chain is. So I think this whole idea of decoupling and deglobalizing and move supply chain elsewhere is not going to be as easily done as it is conceived. I think China has strong resilience for domestic supply and also excess factory capacity to ship globally. So domestic supply is up, global demand, China can elastically deliver that, and the ability to make 1 million drinks in a couple of weeks. That kind of capability, I think, is very strong. And I think the whole world should take advantage of it rather than try to isolate it.
Zambisa, do you think that's likely? Do you think the whole world is going to, that China's maybe, 5 years ahead of the rest of us, and we're all going to be living in this digital science fiction world that Kai-Fu is in right now, where you have robots delivering your food every day to your apartment, right?
I do.
Well, I am optimistic in many respects. And I think one of the things that Kai-Fu said that's really important is that to the extent that we've seen innovation, really, let's just take the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a lot of progress in areas such as consumerism, in social networks. But there's enormous hope that there'll be real technological advancements in public goods, education, healthcare. I know Kai-Fu's got some great examples of some of the things that are happening. Contact tracing is just one example of how they were able to deploy in an efficient way a system, a technological system that is, leads to telemarketing and in health, but also really challenges the status quo. So, fundamentally, I am a big buyer of technology. We haven't talked about where I think there are opportunities for the investments in the future. I think technology is one of them in areas of public policy, but more generally as well. But and if you think about where China is vis-a-vis Europe, I think in many respects, China is in the 1950s, 1960s in terms of looking ahead and the opportunity for growth. I'm not talking about in terms of its economic development. I'm talking about where you see real important government interventions, really important investment in infrastructure, in this case, technology. So I'm very optimistic. I'm very much a big time investor vis-a-vis China. I'm very much pro-investment in technology.
So the question I have for both of you is are we going to see a bunch of non-Chinese companies basically looking at these incredible advances that the kind of thing that Kai-Fu was just talking about, flipping the whole design and sales model on its head. Are we going to see a bunch of Western companies which we can invest in, realize how efficient that is, and go ahead and do it? Or which would be like, I guess, the deglobalization way that everyone has to kind of reinvent this wheel themselves? Or is there still some kind of hope for globalization, moving the other way, where inventions made in China, like say TikTok, can take over the entire world and remain on some level Chinese? Dan, see you first.
Sure. So maybe I give a little bit of a perspective from Western boardrooms, because I happen to serve in a number of Western boardrooms. And I think it's clear to say that for the last 50 years, we've gotten spoiled around understanding a particular model of how business works. We have tended to build organizations that are based in New York or London, or maybe in Silicon Valley, but they have subsidiaries around the world. But what that means is how we raised our capital was go to London and New York, low interest rates, borrow in those markets and invest in higher yielding economies like Brazil or South Africa and China, etc. How did we hire? We relied on the global pool of talent, and we moved people around to run different businesses. How did we think about supply chains? We thought, wait a second, we should go to low-cost provider. I mean, these are things we all know. And what I'm suggesting is largely because of the low growth environment, which is not going away. And in fact, if you look at some of the McKinsey forecasts around equity returns, returns are also materially expected to be down for the foreseeable future, more like 4% equity returns as opposed to 8% where they were certainly before 2008. And so when you look at the world in that respect, there is and we've seen a big backlash against global markets. We're living through Brexit. We've seen what's happened with the America First strategy with the United States. So because there's not an easy economic solution to that political discontent, I do worry that there is a bigger pivot towards much more insular economies. And what I tell my boardrooms is that we have to prepare for that eventuality. I think it is an eventuality where, in terms of trade and commerce, in terms of security and cyber, issues of capital movements, employment, etc., I think the world is going to be much more fractured, and we're not exactly bulletproof from that risk in terms of how businesses have been run. I would like to think I'm wrong, and because I am very much a globalist. I love the idea of globalization and low-cost producers, etc. But I think that's very much textbook, and it's very hard to implement when there's a global backlash and income inequality is where it is.
So, Kai-Fu, last word to you. You literally wrote the book on the AI arms race between China and the US, basically. And is that just going to intensify now in this era of deglobalization? Are we going to have these two rival powers and very little coming together? Is that the forecast?
Well, I think it depends on the American policy, right? The Chinese policy has always been to prefer globalization, but if the American policy forces this kind of decoupling, then China would respond in kind. So I hope the American policies will change or at least shift a little bit. But to answer your earlier question, what I think, whether the two countries or companies collaborate, compete globally or deglobalized, what is important is that American companies have been the leaders in the world for the last 40 years in high tech. And Chinese entrepreneurs have always looked to American companies for inspirations and ideas. And now Chinese companies are mature and they're doing great things. Chinese entrepreneurs look at both US and China and integrate the best ideas. So if someone is in Silicon Valley or Europe for that matter, and all they look at is US and they ignore China, then they will be starting out of the gate missing 50% of the nutrients. It's like going through school, instead of getting your textbook, only reading the odd pages. So I sure hope some of the ideas I gave will give some ideas to people in the West to start a company like that, because it's probably not likely a Chinese company can take these ideas and go global.
Imran, back to you in London. When you started Business of Fashion, were you inspired at all by anything in China, or is that just beginning now, those inspirations?
I mean, a lot of my early trips to China certainly inspired my understanding about how important this market it has become for the industry. And I think, next year, as our industry looks ahead, more than 50% of consumption in the fashion industry is expected to come from Chinese consumers. So once they get back traveling around the world again, I think we'll see the impact of that in Europe and the United States. But Felix, since you did throw it back to me, I do have a couple of questions for all of you, actually, because one thing that didn't come up is this new global trade deal that was revealed, not long ago, that was led by China. And in a way, it seems like it was a kind of a replacement or a kind of response to the kind of collapse of the TPP deal that was mooted under President Obama. I mean, what do all of you think about, the impact of that deal in terms of kind of China's growing influence in that region? Maybe Dambisa, I don't know if you have a perspective first.
Yeah, look, I think, I find China's approach, eminently fascinating because it's not just about trade. It's about foreign direct investment. They are leading in terms, in fact, today, China is the largest lender to the emerging market. So it is a multi-pronged approach. I think we are also seeing the evolution of China from being really a low-cost producer that was making trinkets, if I may, I think we used to call it widgets when I was in school, to really now much more sophisticated provider of goods and services to the world. There's so many additional dynamics. What does that mean? It means that low-cost producers could be in Vietnam or in other places in Asia and across the world. So, it goes back to the heart of the matter. I love the idea of globalization. Unfortunately, this is the second time in 100 years that this whole idea and notion of globalization has really come under challenge. The first time, as I mentioned, was after 1929 financial crash, stock market depression that followed. We had Smoot-Hawley, real tariffs and imposition of a very aggressive sort of deglobalization. Then it cost us 25 years, certainly in the United States, 25 years of low economic growth, high unemployment. And we thought we'd learned. So we went gangbusters. We've had great run from 1950 to 2008. I'm afraid now it's not economic. It's no longer an economic question. It's a political one, as far as I can see.
Kai-Fu, go ahead, Felix. Yeah.
Yeah, I just add that what you were talking about, this regional comprehensive economic partnership, the one with China in the middle of it, it feels more of a balkanization of the world, to be honest. Like you, as you say, we had the TPP, which was designed to isolate China, everyone like ganging up against China. Now we have RCEP, which is trying to bring people together with the United States being excluded. And it's always like, you can never have anything with both countries in it. And even RCEP, like right now, there's a major trade war between China and Australia, which are both members of this partnership. So I think that Dambisa is right, that you have this incredibly huge force that is China, which has the RCEP, it has the Belt and Road Initiative, it has all of these different components to it. And really we are becoming this kind of bipolar world rather than any sort of grand globalization where everyone gets to work on a level playing field with everyone else.
Kai-Fu, is there anything you would add?
Yeah, I just think this whole idea of deglobalization is very, very not well thought out. The whole world has been built up with these intricate connections, with dependencies, with each country doing what it does best, and therefore it's an efficient system. Now, if you try to force one country out, what will happen is you'll have two ecosystems, both of which are not ideal or efficient, and then you will actually, you may be trying to stifle a country by pushing it out of the ecosystem, but that country, in order to survive, has to drive for itself technologically self-sufficiency. And secondly, it has to build its own supply chain as a parallel supply chain. And to the extent that country is very good at innovation and very good at building its own supply chain, then the initiator will actually be paying the price and the consequence, because many of the areas in which it dominated, let's say semiconductor, operating systems, it's maybe forcing half of the world out. And I think it would be serious consequence and very just the opposite of what was intended if one does not really begin to rethink this at global scale.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Felix Salmon in New York, Dambisa Moyo in London, Kai-Fu Lee in Beijing. Thank you for your global perspectives on the economy in 2021. Recently, the idea of measuring the success of an economy solely by GDP and GDP growth has been called into question. The Beyond GDP movement focuses on identifying and developing other indicators, markers as clear as GDP, but more inclusive of environmental and social aspects of progress as well. Please stay tuned for our next talk with Oxford professor Jan-Emmanuel Deneve. Stay with us. Welcome back to Voices 2020. Jan-Emmanuel Deneve is a Belgian economist and professor, and today he joins us from the University of Oxford, where he directs the Well-Being Research Center. He is also an editor of the World Happiness Report. In a recently published article in Nature magazine, he and co-author Jeffrey Sachs cite the 1987 Brundtland Report as the origins of sustainable development thinking. They define this as development that meets the needs of the current generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. To explain how sustainable development improves human well-being, please welcome Jan-Emmanuel Deneve to Voices 2020. Over to you, Jan-Emmanuel.
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be. Good to see you, Imran, and thank you for having me on your amazing program. From Oxford, the Home Office, I have to add, and I'm very pleased to be with you. I know that this session is about making sense of 2020 and charting a way forward. And so if there's one thing I want you to take away from this session, or at least from my talk, is that COVID-19 has really put a spotlight on the importance of mental health and well-being of all of us. And in terms of building back better, that means we need to start measuring it properly, because we have to measure what we treasure. And the ultimate good for most people is their well-being and their mental health. And so that is exactly what this talk is about, beyond GDP. And as Imran noted, how can we build back better? And what is there beyond GDP? And what can we do to chart a way forward? Now, well-being and mental health were important before COVID-19, of course. And so if we look at, for example, the last few decades, notwithstanding a doubling, even tripling of GDP sometimes, we see that well-being and mental health have not necessarily improved. In fact, if we look at the recent United States numbers, we'll even note that 1 in 3 individuals at the moment experience worry, stress, or anger from a day-to-day, in terms of day-to-day experiences. So we're not going in the right direction, and these are worse numbers than they were a decade ago, notwithstanding a whole decade of a bull run, historically low unemployment, and yet people aren't feeling any better. So this is why I'm sounding the alarm bells and pushing for a new sense of urgency of moving beyond GDP. And I am not the first one to do so, of course. And so if we can move to the first slide, please, then we will see a beautiful quote by Bobby Kennedy. And I could not put this any better. And what Bobby Kennedy noted is that GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. And I think it's a good starting point to start thinking about other ways of measuring progress and development and putting well-being center stage. And just to make this quote by Bobby Kennedy come to life, let me tell you, if we go to war as a society, GDP increases. If we build more prisons, GDP increases. If we build or sell more arms, GDP increases. And on the contrary, volunteering, caring for others, none of that improves our GDP. Same thing for the amazing volunteer-based Wikipedia, an amazing public good that we all benefit from. Well, would you believe that does not add to GDP? If anything, something amazing like Wikipedia subtracts from GDP for the simple reason that we're now no longer selling thousands and thousands of long paper copies of encyclopedia. So we need to start thinking beyond GDP, and it's incredibly frustrating that till this day, we are still looking at GDP and income and growth as sort of the main KPIs, which is the business language for key performance indicators. Now, if we move to the next slide, which I can do myself, there we go. We can see that it is even more frustrating because somebody whom I don't think most people will know, but who is a famous economist, Simon Kuznets, and an early Nobel Prize winner in economics. Why is Simon Kuznets famous to us economists? Is because he is the one who invented GDP. He is the one who invented what was at the time called national income accounts. And would you believe that Simon Kuznets himself, the moment he introduces the national income accounts, which became GDP, in 1934, in front of the US Congress, noted, please do not use my measure as a measure for the welfare of a nation. And so again, it is incredibly troubling to some extent that notwithstanding the warning from the original person having built and established GDP, that we see ourselves essentially taking GDP as the overarching measure. And trickling down from GDP, we see income and growth at the individual and society or business levels becoming the end-all, be-all. So we need to do much better on that front. And I'm pleased to say that there is a lot of movement on this particular front. And I'll hark back to, I think, a moment in time that will be historic when historians look back on it, which is the United Nations. The General Assembly unanimously voted to start supplementing measures of GDP with measures of well-being and happiness, to start thinking about beyond GDP in a more holistic framework for how to think about societal progress. And if you think, and this is an important point I'd like to make, and a shout out to all female leaders who are watching this, all the countries around the world, or rather those countries around the world who are taking well-being seriously and are looking for more holistic frameworks to do their public budgeting or measuring their progress, all the leaders worldwide are women. So it starts with New Zealand, just in the Ardern. We have the Finnish Prime Minister, we have the Scottish Prime Minister, we have the Icelandic Prime Minister, taking a move beyond GDP and thinking about sustainability and well-being as the core values and the core measures to be looked at whenever considering progress and making a budget. Now, that same year, 2011-2012, we were then asked and took the initiative of building a World Happiness Report, or producing one, leveraging all the available data on happiness and well-being around the world. And so we launched this at the United Nations each year on March 20th, which was then announced the International Day of Happiness. And so you see there's a number of these initiatives moving and coming along that are putting well-being metrics more and more to the fore. And you will have come across the World Happiness Report at some point in time, because whenever anybody talks about the happiest country in the world, or Finland taking over from Denmark, or something of that kind of titles that you'll see in the news, that is our work, and that comes through our measurements. And so maybe it's worthwhile just spending a minute about how to practically do well-being measurements. And so when we look at well-being around the world, I want to be very clear about one thing. It is not an index. We are not putting a number of dimensions together. We are simply asking people a single question. On a scale from 1 to 10, how satisfied are you with your life these days? And thanks to the Gallup organization, we asked this of representative samples in all countries around the world each year. It is a huge undertaking, the one that underpins the World Happiness Report. And in turn, the World Happiness Report gets millions of downloads each year and is starting to spread both the science of well-being, its measurement, and starting to underpin policy as well. Now, what can you do with well-being data? And so let me show you, and essentially show you what we've just discussed. If you zoom in and look carefully at this particular graph, this is that relationship between GDP and happiness or well-being across the world. And so all these dots represent countries. And you'll see the answer, the average answer to the question, how satisfied are you with your lives, runs, even though it's on a scale from 0 to 10, the lowest country scores an average of about 3. We're looking at Central African Republic, we're looking at India, just above 4, etc. The happiest countries in the world, you'll may be surprised or not so surprised to hear, are Finland, Denmark, Norway, Switzerland. Now, if you look at the horizontal axis, that is your GDP per capita, running from about 5,000 GDP per capita to 75,000 GDP per capita. And what I'm after, of course, is that relationship. And it won't take a genius to realize that the relationship here is one of diminishing marginal returns. So poorer countries developing economically improve their well-being. But for richer nations, 15,000, 20,000 GDP per capita and above, further economic growth does not necessarily translate to further well-being. And this is pretty clear from this graph. There's diminishing marginal returns to GDP. And so for the nations at the top, we need to start thinking beyond GDP. We need to find ways to essentially change that curve. And so if we move, I'm now going to go to the next slide, which gives you that solution. And Imran introduced this very nicely. Just a few months ago in Nature magazine, Jeffrey Sachs and I published a massive piece of work where we combined for the first time the international well-being data that we use for the World Happiness Report and matched that against the SDG index, which shows you the extent to which nations are improving and doing well in terms of sustainable growth. In other words, to what extent are they achieving the SDGs, and is there growth of sustainable level? The key takeaway, and there's a number of other takeaways, but the key one you'll immediately notice, in contrast to traditional growth, here the relationship is one of increasing marginal returns to sustainable growth in terms of well-being. Whereas in terms of GDP, we found decreasing marginal returns. So the curvature here is incredibly important. So the key to continuing to translate further growth into well-being for nations is by moving on the SDGs and doing it the right way. That is the sort of the big above the full line, the headline result from the relationship between SDGs and well-being. Now, the story becomes slightly more complex and interesting, I would argue, if we zoom into the 17 SDGs, because what I'm showing you here is the average relationship between how countries are doing in terms of sustainable development, sustainable growth, and well-being. But if we move into and split this into the 17 SDGs, and I'm sorry, you may not be used to seeing lots of graphs and tables in short presentations like this, but I find this incredibly important. This is the 17 SDGs for people who care about sustainable development. And as you would have suspected, all of them, except a few, are positively correlated with well-being. So doing well on health, doing well on education, eradicating poverty are, needless to say, very positively associated with improving people's well-being. But I know a lot of you are in the field of business, and I want you to zoom in on SDG 12. SDG 12 is responsible consumption and production. That is precisely the SDG that I presume a lot of you are dealing with or can take action on, because people in the business of fashion will be working with customers and trying to bring up notions of better and more responsible consumption. And you're also producing, and so you're probably investing in trying to have responsible ways of production through better sourcing of material and what have you. And so I really applaud all this effort because it is the right thing to do. But what this study shows is that this is the one element where ordinary people, the average population, has a difficult, complex relationship with SDG 12 and their well-being. So I want you to think about, for example, the following example. We have, when we go into the supermarkets these days, we have to bring in our own little plastic bags or bags rather than receiving them. That is changing people's behaviors and making it slightly less comfortable for them, but for good reasons. And so while people appreciate the outcome of an ecologically and environmentally sustainable policy, the policy itself can sometimes be difficult for people. And so whenever governments and policymakers think about achieving and improving on the SDGs, especially responsible consumption and production, we want to also think about compensating and thinking through the difficulties and the challenges that some people face. So for example, in the case of business of fashion, I would argue charging a premium or a larger price for something that is better sourced or locally sourced material is the right thing to do. And it is about making sure that people understand why this is happening and trying to get around some of the frustrations of no longer having access to cheap goods from China, for example. I will slowly return the floor to Imran. And I know and I'm keen to answer any questions that he or you may have moving forward. Thank you ever so much for indulging me on this point, and over to you, Imran.
Thank you, Jan Emmanuel. Indeed, there are a lot of questions. Many people see your talk as an interesting response to the previous talk. We had, three economists and experts on global business. And one of the questions that's coming through from all over the place is, hasn't the pandemic proven that this incessant search for GDP growth is no longer a viable system? Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I would argue it's not just the pandemic who's made that very clear. It's also everything moving up until that point. Because if you simply look at the last decade or two, you'll find that we've had lots and lots of growth. Or, for example, look at just the last decade, pre-COVID, the bull run. Huge Dow Jones shooting past 30,000, historically low unemployment. And yet we see well-being stagnating and in some cases even diminishing. So we need to think differently, and COVID, I think, is an opportunity for us to transition to a world where we put well-being and mental health much more center stage. And there are ways of doing that operationally. I can point you in the direction of a new publication, the British Medical Journal, where we talk about well-being years as a metric rather than cost-benefit analysis at the heart of policy.
The other thing I wanted to quickly address with you, I appreciated that curve that showed that, GDP growth in and of itself or higher GDP per capita doesn't necessarily lead to more happiness, but there must be a fundamental level which you need to get across And so many people are talking about the idea of universal basic income. What are your thoughts on that kind of policy, which is starting to be discussed very seriously in certain policy circles?
Yeah, Imran, thank you, and thank you for whomever is asking that question, because it is absolutely true. And the last thing I would like you to take away from this talk is the naive notion that money doesn't buy you happiness, or richer nations are not necessarily happier. That is only the case once you've passed a certain point. And you'll recall from the graph, countries like Eritrea, Central African Republic, India, countries that are 5, 6, 7,000 GDP per capita, you bet that if you can raise them to 10,000, 15,000, even 20,000 GDP per capita, and even if it isn't always that sustainable in nature, that kind of growth, it will translate into greater well-being. So the whole spiel about money doesn't make you happy or GDP doesn't make nations happier really is only valid after a specific point, and I would argue about 20,000 GDP per capita onwards. And that then brings us to the point of universal basic income. So there's no question that at the bottom of the pay scale, or at the bottom of people's people at the bottom of income levels, or no income levels whatsoever, we can do an incredible amount of good by giving them essentially transfers of money in an autonomous way, non-stigmatized way, to make sure that they can do the very basics in life.
One last question that's come through from Mirko Buccianti in Italy. He makes the point that if we're going to stop relying on GDP solely on a kind of macroeconomic basis, what does that imply for the metrics that companies are using to measure their success? Because everyone's measuring, public companies in particular measure their success on growth and profit. So if we're going to start expanding the measures of GDP on a macro level, what does that mean for the way companies need to manage and measure their impact?
Oh, I'm so excited about this question because it's spot on and it's something I'm working on right now. So what companies should do, maybe they can't, society should be measuring life satisfaction, well-being as an ultimate outcome. But companies, at the very least, should be caring about their immediate stakeholders, which are their employees and their families. And so by measuring job satisfaction, you will improve life. And so in improving on job satisfaction, it means that you're increasing life satisfaction. And because happiness and well-being are socially contagious, if you do well for your workers, you will do well for their families. And well-being and happiness spreads across 3 degrees of separation onwards. So you'll be doing most well by essentially focusing on your workers and measuring job satisfaction and acting upon it to improve it. A fantastic piece in the McKinsey Quarterly just came out on this particular front, making that case if there's one thing that companies can do, it's focus on job satisfaction, because that is the biggest contribution they can make to societal life satisfaction. And thus the ESGs. And I know the person who asked the question is Italian, and he'll be very pleased to know that earlier today I was speaking with Snam, the largest gas utility in Italy, and also Illy Foundation, Illy Coffee, and Andrea Illy himself, the founder or the chairman of Illy Coffee, is measuring happiness and is one of the funders of the World Happiness Report. And within these companies, you'll see a move towards measuring job satisfaction as the S in ESG, because I know we're all about ESG. Environment gets measured, good governance. But in terms of the S, the social impact, I'm going to make a big push with all the companies I've just mentioned who are on board for this to measure job satisfaction, because that is one practical way that companies themselves can contribute to societal well-being.
Okay, lots to take away there for all of the fashion business leaders watching today. Thank you, Jan-Emmanuel Deneve.
Thank you, Imran.
We've been tracking the growing power of technology companies since the very first Voices back in 2016. Well, this year, we're pleased to be bringing back Christopher Wylie. 2 years ago, his Voices talk made global headlines as he exposed how Facebook and Cambridge Analytica managed to co-opt fashion brands and fashion imagery to target potential Trump voters before the 2016 presidential election. Here's a quick flashback to his talk.
It is up to you if Trump or if Brexit or if the alt-right either become Crocs or become Chanel of our political age. The technology sector may live by Zuckerberg's mantra of move fast and break things, but society is being broken in the process. And so it is time for culture makers to step in and hopefully to move fast so that we can fix things. So fix these narratives. Start by engaging your customers, challenge them, make them think, make them feel, make them understand, show them a reality for once. And you have to, we have to, because if we lose our culture, we will lose our humanity in the process. So that is my challenge to you.
So powerful to see that talk once again, I'm sure you'll agree. This year, antitrust authorities in Europe, the US, and China have all been paying closer attention to the growing power of big technology companies and the impact they have on our society. So much so that there are growing calls for big tech companies to be broken up. More than 1/5 of Chinese consumer goods are now bought on Alibaba, which has recently come under scrutiny from the Chinese government. In the United States, the CEOs of Facebook, Alphabet, Amazon, and Apple were brought in for questioning by the US Congress. And here in Europe, Amazon has come under fire in the preliminary findings of an EU antitrust probe. I'm now delighted to welcome Christopher Wiley here to the Voices studio in London. And joining him in San Francisco is Roger McNamee, an early investor in Facebook and mentor to Mark Zuckerberg. Roger and Christopher, over to you both.
Thanks. Hi, so thanks for getting up super early. So I think to start with, we should sort of set the scene. In the past, U.S. presidential election, there was calls to break up big tech. Senator Warren, Bernie Sanders, lots of people at Congress have been super critical. But it wasn't always like that, right? So, flashback sort of 5 years ago, and, this was the industry that was sort of the thing that people were celebrating. It was the enlightened industry. It was the thing that was bringing us into the future. And even you yourself were, once an advisor to Facebook and many other sort of big tech companies. So maybe sort of walk us back and start from the beginning. What changed and what's so different now compared to before?
So Chris, when I first came to Silicon Valley, almost 40 years ago, the Valley was very much still in that cultural moment at the intersection of the space program and the hippie movement that was introduced to Silicon Valley by Atari. And Steve Jobs was really the iconic figure of that era, even more so than Bill Gates. He was a big believer that technology empowered the people who could use it. That was the culture of Silicon Valley from the 50s all the way to the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, Google had a great insight, which was that computers had reached the point now where they could convert human experience into data. And if they converted enough human experience into data, they could predict people's behavior and sell that first to advertisers. And then later they'd figured out, wow, we can actually manipulate what people believe and we can manipulate what they do. And so they built this thing, which is called surveillance capitalism. And they did it very quietly. And then Facebook comes along and applies it to the emotional world of social media. And with Facebook, suddenly you were in this situation where people were disclosing their innermost feelings. And the next thing you know, Chris, we've suddenly got a situation where provoking people's emotions becomes the business model. And once that happened, it was possible for bad actors to use the infrastructure of Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Google to manipulate elections, to undermine pandemic responses. And the thing that we've seen over the last few years is this cascading series of catastrophes going from the online world into the real world, to the point where in the United States, our pandemic response has been a disaster, where Trump has used social media to make people lose confidence in elections. And our entire society is being torn apart by this.
So you're an advocate of antitrust as one of the sort of legal vehicles we could use to fix this issue. Do you want to maybe explain a little bit, like, what actually is antitrust for people who don't know it or have heard of it, but don't really live in that world? And why is antitrust an important vehicle to fix some of the problems that we're seeing within big tech?
So the issue in technology is that these companies have literally been unregulated. But in a sense, it's worse than that, because in the United States, we have a law called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It was created in 1996 to get the industry started, but it basically has been interpreted by courts as blanket protection against liability for anything that goes wrong on an internet platform like Facebook or Google. Well, the problem with that is that as the failures have gotten larger, suddenly we're faced with three issues. First, these products are actually not safe. Secondly, they invade your privacy and take away your right to self-determination. But thirdly, and this is what antitrust is about, these companies are now monopolies. And so they've basically caused a halt in innovation in the tech space outside their world. And so a lot of really cool ideas are not coming to market because these guys prevent it from doing so. So the notion here is that we need to have three kinds of regulation. We need to require liability to these companies for the harms they do. We need to guarantee humans the right to control their own data. And then lastly, we need to do something about how big and powerful these companies are. And the right way of doing that is controlling their business model and then ultimately breaking them up into smaller pieces.
So last summer, we saw, I think, a pretty interesting moment, at least within this sort of entire dialogue about big tech and what to do about it. The Stop Hate for Profit campaign, which you were involved with, along with many other NGOs and civil rights organizations, calling for large companies and small companies alike to pull back their advertising from Facebook to make a point that Facebook shouldn't profit from hate. Facebook comes back and says, well, we don't actually profit from hate. This is, not what we're about, and, this is not the right way to go. So on one hand, do you think that this quote-unquote techlash is forming part of a cultural moment, or do you think that this was just another excuse for big companies to woke wash and, sort of make a false stand for something to gain activist support?
So I think it's really easy to miss what matters about 2020. But in the United States, we've had a series of things going on. So the pandemic triggered an economic correction, a collapse, if you will, huge unemployment, lots of issues. And our ability to respond to it has been undermined by disinformation spread over internet platforms. And because everybody was at home, they could see the disinformation spreading. So suddenly the responsibility that Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and Google and YouTube have is obvious to everybody. But then George Floyd was killed. And the murder of George Floyd, again, with everybody at home in quarantine watching it, revealed how the role that Facebook in particular plays in amplifying hate, and particularly white supremacist hate, and the role that they were playing in organizing and recruiting people into white supremacist organizations and into things like QAnon. And all this took place in plain sight. So the original idea for Stop Hate for Profit began with the actor Sacha Baron Cohen. But what gave it legitimacy, what caused it to really come together, was the murder of George Floyd, which is when Color of Change, with Rashad Robinson, who'll be speaking in a few moments, the NAACP, the Anti-Defamation League, Common Sense Media, and Free Press all came together, civil rights organizations, to call attention to the fact that, wait a minute, all of this hate doesn't happen in a vacuum. Advertisers are paying for it. And by calling attention to the connection between the commercial and the problem, that really caused a pivot in public perception of what was going on. And there have been a whole series of things going on since then, but the pressure has mounted dramatically. And Facebook can say whatever it wants. The simple fact is, it amplifies hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories for profit. Those are the lubricants of its business model. And you know that it's a problem because they refuse to change the business model to end that amplification.
So there was a big focus on Facebook, but I think Amazon's another large company in the mix here, and we've got an audience watching who of people predominantly who work in fashion or the creative spaces, and something that they might not know about Amazon is they're actively recruiting people from the fashion industry. They've filed patents for automated clothing manufacture. They've released all kinds of research in computer vision AI for fashion trend forecasting. And when you look at the sort of business model of Amazon, it uses consumer data to anticipate trends, predict trends, and then create product offerings for people. And when you look at the legacy of fashion, so much of it is this trend-driven industry. Do you think that Jeff Bezos is going to replace the Anna Wintours of the world as the next sort of ultimate forecaster in fashion? And what does that mean if you are a fashion company watching? What should we be thinking about when it comes to Amazon?
So the key thing to understand is, Chris, the way you describe it is how it began. But what happened is they accumulated more data as their platforms became more important in our lives. Companies like Amazon developed the power not just to predict our behavior, but actually to drive it. So the way to think about it is when you're in shopping, Amazon controls the menus. So when you do a search, it's their search engine. They give you the list of choices. Well, in doing so, they can drive choices. So they go way past trend setting to something much scarier, which is picking the winner. And the reason this matters is the culture of Silicon Valley isn't optimized on consumer choice. It's not about making us better. It's about efficiency. Their profit comes from getting all of us to do what they want, which is to say the same thing. In their world, everybody wears the same clothes. In their world, everybody believes the same things because that's more efficient. And here's the thing. The fashion industry has a superpower. You're actually connected to culture. The people in the world actually want to find their own identity. They actually want to be part of of cultural moments. And the critical element here is you can't sit back and just allow this to happen. You have to recognize as an industry that these guys are changing the rules and you can fight back.
So what?
And the same. Go ahead.
Oh, so if you've got lots of people watching in companies, what would you actually recommend? There's a lot of scary things that could potentially happen with big tech, not just in terms of our society, but also as somebody who works in the industry, the disruption that we've seen in the past with publishing or music or whatever. Is that coming for us? And if you had anything to say to the leaders of the fashion industry, what would it be in terms of our response to this?
So the most important thing is do not assume anything is inevitable. So the powerful thing in this moment is the politics are against these guys. And the only thing that saves them is the inertia of an advertising industry that doesn't recognize that these guys are going to end the advertising industry. Right? They're going to pick the winners. And the fashion industry is the next tier of response. You have the ability to influence culture. You don't just follow trends. People in your industry also start the trends. And the core point here is you need to think about the industry differently. You need to think about distribution differently. You need to think about communications differently. You cannot constantly concede to internet companies the primary access to your audience. Every industry needs to find alternative ways of reaching the people in its markets. You need to stop adopting each new platform, assuming that somehow Instagram will save you from Facebook. TikTok will save you from Instagram. Until, as an industry, you guys start to create your own ways of communicating, I think you're going to have a problem. But the really good news is you have something these companies don't have. You have a heart. You have culture. People want to hear what you think. So your ability to create alternative ways to communicate is completely there. But here's what's really good about it. You don't have to do all this work yourself. You're in the same boat as every other industry in the economy. And so as a consequence, sorry about the light here. It's very early morning here. The sun is bright. So every other industry is there. Governments want to make change. Give them the political power. Support change. Do not support this industry by blindly following every little thing it does. If you do that, then you're no longer setting trends. You're following these guys.
So really quickly, because we're running out of time, do you think that in terms of this sort of cross-industry collaboration, really tangibly, and we've got just over a minute left, what could that look like? And shoot some ideas for the people watching.
So creating new technology is dead easy. And there's a million people in the venture community who will create it for you if you come in and say, listen, we would like to start to create an infrastructure that allows us to do fashion shows online, that allows us to do all these things, that creates assets that people could share in other places, but that you guys control, and to give you the primary voice where they need to come to you. So you sit there and you've got to help the guys who publish Vogue to go beyond just magazines, to actually recognizing that their moment is about having online fashion shows and about having online experiences that allow people to believe and to recognize their individual humanity through fashion. And, again, this is the world you need to figure out. I'm happy to help with it. The technology is very inexpensive, but you're going to have to give up a year or two of profit in order to make the investment that keeps you in business 10 years from now.
Great. Well, thanks. We're just running out of time for this section, but interesting ideas in terms of cross-industry collaboration and exploring sort of something that people often don't really think about, that a lot of these big tech companies or things like antitrust really do actually impact the creative sector just as much as they impact all these other industries that we've seen being disrupted. So I think we're now going to sort of pass it over to Imran, and we have a couple more questions, I think, from the audience. So over to you.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Roger. That was fascinating. We've actually had some questions come through from all around the world. One question I wanted to pose to both of you is this: if this antitrust movement continues, how would it impact the average consumer who uses these tools? Maybe Christopher, do you have a point of view on that first?
In terms of, well, I think that one of the problems with the conversation that we so often have about technology is it often is very individualized. What can I do about problematic technology? What can I do to protect my privacy or combat disinformation? And ultimately, I think these are architectures that are designed by engineers, by these large companies that have the power to change it. And I think when we're looking at solutions like antitrust or more regulation, it really pushes back the responsibility onto companies rather than individuals, because the solutions lie within these large firms, so that people don't have to think about these things in the future. When you step onto an airplane, when you take a drug from your doctor, when you go and buy food from a store, you don't have to think about safety. You don't have to think about a lot of these things because there's rules in place to protect you. And I think a lot of what these sort of this tech conversation is all about is really protecting people at the end of the day.
Okay. Elsa in London has an additional question about disinformation, and she said, "Who defines what disinformation is? Is there a risk that freedom of speech will be curtailed under the guise of disinformation?" Roger, why don't I throw that one to you?
So really great question. So the core thing to understand is that no one in the reform movement wants to stamp on speech. What we're trying to do is to end the amplification for profit of hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. So important distinction. The algorithms of these platforms are trying to provoke an emotional response in people. And the best way to do that is to either piss them off or scare them. And so in doing that, they're amplifying the content that is most emotionally engaging. And that's where the harm comes from. So we're not trying to do anything to limit speech. We're just trying to limit the amplification of the harmful kinds of speech.
Christopher, anything to add?
Yeah, I think, when we talk about free speech, there's a difference between your right to say something and your right to be artificially, amplified, to be given a megaphone, right? There's nothing, no one is saying you shouldn't be allowed to think or believe whatever weird conspiracies you want. The difference is that these platforms are not neutral. So when you go onto, Facebook, there are many pieces of technology interacting with each other to decide, what you see at the top versus the bottom of your news feed. And what that means is that there are certain kinds of, speech that is problematic, that is artificially amplified. And, I think it was Sacha Baron Cohen that said that, if you were a restaurant owner and you had, Nazis goose step into your restaurant, what would a responsible owner say? Oh, no, free speech. We've got to let them in. We've got to let them shout at our customers. Or would they say, you know what? You can believe what you want, but not at my establishment. And that's not an infringement on speech. That is a rational response to hate and disinformation.
One final question, which has come from Catherine in the UK. So many fashion businesses have become very reliant on these platforms to reach customers. What would you recommend to them if they don't want to support these kinds of technology platforms? Roger, how about you going first?
So the most important things to do, there's two parts of the element. One, lend your voice to the politics of regulating these companies. Because to Chris's point, there's nothing wrong with the underlying technology. The issue here is the business model. So we want to force changes there. And then the second thing is, these guys have inserted themselves between companies and their customers. Do everything in your power to maintain a direct relationship with the people who are interested in your products. Give them assets that they can share. Give them things that give you control of that customer experience. And at the moment, they're not that expensive. Experiments will work because these guys aren't going to kill you tomorrow, but they are going to kill you over 5 years. So you do need to start investing in this right now. But I'm really optimistic that the fashion industry is actually going to be one of the leaders for getting us out of this problem, because you're not going to be alone. Every other industry wants to help. The difference is you're actually in the culture business, so you have much more influence. And if you use your voice constructively, it's going to make a huge difference.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Thank you, Roger McNamee in San Francisco, Christopher Wiley here in the Voices studio. Just over 3 years ago, a short walk from where we are now, 72 people lost their lives in a fire at Grenfell Tower. The tragedy shocked the country, but not the most vulnerable people in our society. They've long been failed by a system that still sees 56,000 people living in tower blocks with the same kind of cladding that fueled the rapid spread of the fire. All around the world, the poor and the vulnerable have been hit hardest by the spread of the virus and the lockdowns that followed. Those without savings are more vulnerable to the effects of furloughs and layoffs, and they're also less able to work from home. Simply put, COVID-19 is exacerbating income inequality, something that's come up multiple times already today, and it has exposed it all for us to see. Stay with us. After the break, British Shadow Secretary of Justice, David Lammy, will join us to discuss growing global inequality. But first, here's a news report by ITN from the day after the Grenfell Tower tragedy.
In the middle of a summer's night, in what they thought was the safety of home, people woke to the smell of smoke, the sound of screaming, and later the scorching heat of flames. Disorientated and terrified, those who could struggled to safety. Others stuck to the established advice, stay where you are. Some decided to jump. What must have been a fire in one flat was magnified and multiplied for reasons we can't yet be sure to just about every other, all in a matter of minutes. A disaster of as yet uncertain scale. It's impossible to imagine the way ahead for those who called Grenfell Tower home. Normal life lies in the embers of this fire. Family, friends, possessions, memories. The kindness of strangers in offers of homes and beds and food is some comfort. But the numbness of loss and shock will hang over this place long after the last wisps of smoke disappear. If it ever leaves, it will only be when there is an answer to the questions: how on earth did and could it happen? From all of us here, good night.
Welcome back to Voices 2020. Now I'm pleased to welcome David Lammy, a member of the British Parliament and Shadow Secretary of Justice. He's here to discuss the long shadow of the Grenfell Tower tragedy, which took place just around the corner from here, and how to address the growing inequality in society. David Lammy, welcome to Voices 2020.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to join you.
I wanted to start with an update on the situation with Grenfell, more than 3 years after the tragedy took place. Where do we stand now in terms of kind of uncovering what happened and addressing the kind of systemic issues that caused the tragedy in the first place?
Well, in the wake of the tragedy, I and others called for an inquiry. There is an inquiry. It's ongoing. The first phase of it has reported and was very critical, I'm afraid, of the fire service and others on the night of the fire. The second stage is underway and evidence is coming out, and it's deeply worrying that many of the developers who built Grenfell Tower have lost pieces of evidence, disregarded, important safety instructions and things, and I think it's caused a lot of dismay and horror. But that inquiry is taking place. We've not had an update from the Metropolitan Police about where the criminal investigation stands. There are many that believe that ultimately this was negligence manslaughter. There needs to be a case in the Old Bailey, and we await that information.
But there are bigger things at play here, David. This morning, or this afternoon rather, we've been talking about inequality in society, and we're living in an increasingly divided society, something that you've referred to as tribalism, which is, not just here in Britain, but all around the world. In your view, why has this happened?
Well, I'm afraid inequality has increased. It's got worse. It's got considerably worse since the crash of 2008. To some extent, you can see this in the pandemic. You can see that the way that the pandemic has devastated lives here in the UK, with Britain having the highest death toll in Europe, that there were underlying issues that led to that. The position of ethnic minorities in society has made them more susceptible to dying from the disease. The situation in our care homes for the elderly has also demonstrated real vulnerability. So inequality is real. It's present here in the UK. You see it also in the death toll in the United States. And this is notwithstanding the issues around how you protect society in terms of shielding or in terms of wearing a mask and other things. And the gap between those that have and those who do not have has grown. The welfare state has been withdrawn. Austerity, public services are sort of creaking, particularly local authorities. It's not just about the government, it's also about the local authorities who aren't just there to take your rubbish away, your library, your schools, your infrastructure, the quality of your roads, whether you've got youth services that are free and available for young people after school. All of these things matter if we're to reduce inequality and make people's lives easier. Very, very sadly, because I'm afraid we didn't fix the roof while the sun was shining in better times. Now we are into this deep recession, depression during the pandemic. And here we have the double shock of the Brexit and leaving the European Union. It's going to be very, very tough indeed.
You talk about all of the services that governments should be providing, and a lot of the reading I've done over the last 9 or 10 months on this topic talks about the breakdown of the social contract. You've spoken passionately for years now about creating a fairer society where everyone has the same rights. So as we look beyond COVID, many people think we have an opportunity ahead of us to build back better. That's the phrase that we keep hearing. What does it mean to build back better now for us in the UK, and how can we apply some of those learnings in other countries around the world?
Well, I take hope. The hope, I think, lies with the millennials. They're a generation that gets it. If we put them in charge, so many of the problems will be fixed. They get climate change. They believe in equality for LGBTQ communities, for minorities. So somehow we've got to really support young people at this time. We cannot leave them to be unemployed. Building back better means them being employed, and we have to use the state. It's a bit like Roosevelt's New Deal. We've got to use stimulus to create the work for that generation. They're a big generation, they're a great generation. So I think there's something about young people. Then there's something about skills. You know, we are losing jobs. We're losing jobs to artificial intelligence and technology, of course. We have to make sure that folk that didn't do so well in school, have not had have access to those jobs. We have to invest in their skills rapidly to take up that employment in those new areas. I think that is really, really, really important. And, you know, building back better means that in the end, the key to any future economy is our education system, our colleges, our schools, our universities, particularly at this time. And I think that also, you know, what we've learned is that our public servants, you know, our nurses, our care workers, these are incredible public servants. And I hope that we can reward them better in the years ahead.
You're speaking today to a global audience of people who work in the fashion industry. And I'm curious what you think the role of creative sectors like fashion have to play in addressing some of these challenges. You know, there's business leaders and creative leaders watching today. You know, what role can our sector play in building back better?
Huge. It was a huge privilege to me to be Tony Blair's culture minister. I'm married to an international artist, portrait painter. The arts is huge. You know, you don't get this iPhone without great creative endeavor. At the moment, our theaters are shut. Theaters are going down. You know, again, you know, in terms of fashion, a lot of this stuff starts on stage. You know, innovation is forged on stage. And, you know, we have to support our theaters to bounce back. We have to support our creative economy. It's a huge share of the UK economy. It's soft power supporting this globally as well and working with other communities affected. So I think that we must not forget the importance of the arts and creativity, the leisure economy. This is a fundamental part of all Western democracies. It's very, very significant. And if we allow it to crumble, our life will be diminished as a consequence.
You know, I was reading some excerpts from your recent book where you talk about this idea of encounter culture, bringing people of opposing views and backgrounds together to foster understanding. And, you know, many of our speakers today have been commenting on the growing division in our society. So, you know, how do we reconcile this growing division with the benefits of living in a multicultural society?
We've got to do better, haven't we, at being able to disagree agreeably. I'm totally against cancel culture, in which we use social media to destroy people and write them off. I think the coarseness of behavior in public life is not great at all. And sadly, we've had a president in the White House who's deployed some of that. Look, encounter culture is about recognizing that we can't just exist in our silos. You know, the radio stations we listen to, the social media that we follow, and it drives you into a bubble. And you just do not understand people with a different worldview. In my own book, Tribes, I explore people that voted for leaving the European Union, people that have different views to immigration to me, but I did it in a way that involved dialogue and conversation, not, you know, demonizing your opponents. And there's probably been way too much of that here in our society, and you're seeing it across the world. So encounter culture is how we come together. And I think it does require governments, organizations to think about, for those that they're in charge, how are we ensuring that our employees in our organization encounter people different to themselves? You know, in our CSR, how are we going into communities that is very different from the ones where our company's based or where our employees are, for example? And obviously for governments, how are we ensuring that a young man growing up in Sunderland, let's say in the northeast of England, is meeting a young black boy growing up in the UK in the sort of foothills of Grenfell Tower? What are we doing in society to promote that encounter, so that we're not, you know, because the problem is if you don't encounter other people, you demonize them, you have suspicions and fears that are often unfounded. And it's amazing that you can be in a country like this, the sixth richest country in the world here, and yet have not encountered people living vastly different lives.
David, I wanted to take some questions from our community who are watching from around the world. Manisha Patel in New York City, she asks, why do some people and places remain resilient to social and systemic inequalities over time? You know, what sets these places apart?
Look, I think that family and how secure family and the family unit is really important. That will vary across countries. I think that access to technology is an important part of that as well, good and bad. The internet has good sides, it has some downsides. And clearly employment and education, those are the variables across different ethnic groups sometimes, and across different cities. The welfare state in the United States is not the same as here in Europe, and it does mean that, you know, the sort of poverty that you see for a developed country is unreal, frankly, relative to European standards.
We have another question from Fulia Ilby in London, and she says, how do you think Brexit will shape the kind of content of inequality in the UK?
I think the short term will be very, very tough. I mean, clearly there will be an economic shock to the UK on leaving the European Union. Our GDP will fall likely 2-3%, as well as the pandemic GDP. So it's definitely going to be a kick. Our biggest trading partner is the European Union. It's about 43% of UK trade. We're unlikely to have a substantial trade deal with the European Union. It will be a very shallow trade deal. It will have a big impact in the short term, no doubt about it.
One final question, which is about some of the reports that emerged during the pandemic about garment workers in Leicester who were working apparently and reportedly in unconscionable conditions, you know, forced to come to work and in non-socially distanced factories in the middle of the confinement period. I mean, what should governments be doing to be kind of cracking down on this kind of activity? Because we hear reports of it for years and years and years, and nothing is done.
This is in part about enforcement. It's about a common set of standards. You know, it's old-fashioned to believe in the trade unions, but this is why we have employment rights. And, you know, in countries like the UK, in the US, increasingly you've got big groups of people who are not unionized. They don't have a union. They don't have collective bargaining rights. They haven't got great working conditions. Sometimes they're on zero-hour contracts. And I think we're seeing during this pandemic how terrible that can be for individuals and how people have been breaching rules for years and years. So that's another one about building back better and learning from this and, you know, creating the kind of economy in countries that make people thrive.
All right. Well, thank you so much, David Lammy, for your time today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Now, while suffering from the devastating effects of the pandemic, the world faced another reckoning after the murder of George Floyd in the U.S. city of Minneapolis in May, as we heard earlier. As was the case here in the UK, the virus had already ripped through America's marginalized communities, creating a crisis in health and financial security. But the killings of George Floyd and other innocent black people unleashed the largest social and political movement in the country's history. In fact, the effects were felt much further afield, with protests taking place in over 60 countries and on all 7 continents. Next, we'll have an unmissable talk on COVID, inequality, and racial justice from the other side of the Atlantic, from Rashad Robinson, president of Color of Change, one of America's leading social justice organizations. We'll see you just after the break. There are common refrains we've been hearing in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. It's time to take action. It's time to dismantle these structures, to take down the vestiges of slavery and colonialism that have been hundreds of years in the making. But how do we turn this awareness into action? To answer that, I'm pleased to welcome Rashad Robinson, president of Color of Change. Over to you, Rashad, in New York.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and it's a pleasure to talk about racial justice, which is increasingly becoming a majoritarian issue as more and more Americans, and hopefully people around the world, wake up to racial injustice and commit themselves to doing the work. At Color of Change, we were founded almost 15 years ago in the aftermath of a flood, Hurricane Katrina, actually a little over 15 years ago. Hurricane Katrina was caused by bad decision makers, and it turned into a life-altering disaster by bad decision makers. Black folks were literally on their roofs begging for the government to do something and left to die. You know, Katrina illustrated a lot of things that people already knew: geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impacts of what we've done to our planet, and so many other issues. But at the heart of it, no one was nervous about disappointing Black people. And you know, part of the work at Color of Change is translating presence and visibility into power, translating the issues that Black people face, the awareness of our issues, into the power to actually change the rules. And so this summer, as more and more people woke up, whether it was the killing of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, the video of George Floyd, or that video from Central Park with Amy Cooper, giving us the strategy that we so often don't get to see. There's a Black man here. He's threatening me. All of those videos waked people up, but we recognize that presence alone doesn't actually translate into change. You know, the thing about presence and visibility, if we mistake that for change, we think that we've done something that we haven't actually done. We will think that a Black president means that we are post-racial. We will think that America, or maybe even the world, loving Black celebrities and Black culture means that America loves Black people as much as America loves Black culture. And America can love, celebrate, and monetize Black culture and hate Black people at the same time. Those two things don't have to be in competition. And so part of what I hope to talk to you about is what we can all do to translate presence and visibility into power, to change the rules, to translate our caring into action. And so, part of this is really recognizing the sort of different worlds that we live in, the sort of different ways and the different responses that white people will get and Black people will get for the same exact interaction, that racism is not just about our individual feelings, it is about an experience that people have every single day. This just shows the differences in responses that communities get to not wearing a mask in the US. The ways in which racism undergirds and permeates every single aspect of our lives, and the ways in which, once again, not simply our caring, but the role of power, whether it's the written rules of policy or the unwritten rules of culture, sort of dictate the ways in which people engage. The other sort of way in which, I want to sort of talk about this issue and talk about sort of where we're at is recognizing the role of power, power being the ability to change the rules. We saw this summer, I'm not sure if my slides are coming up. Okay, there we go. I want to go one more. We saw many changes take place this year. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, were they real changes in the rules that affect Black people's lives? Were they changes that actually made things different? We heard corporations saying Black Lives Matter. We saw celebrities speaking out. We saw people donating money. But once again, we have to continue to interrogate our role in sort of the way in which these issues impact people's lives. These issues impact sort of the engagement. And we have to start first and foremost by actually explaining and talking about the problem the right way. Far too often we talk about the issues of race in a passive voice. We will talk about communities impacted in active ways and the systems in a passive way. So we will say things like, Black people are less likely to get hired in the fashion industry, instead of the fashion industry excludes Black people. On one hand, we end up with a whole lot of mentorship pipeline programs that don't actually hold an industry accountable, that try to fix Black people and try to fix people who have been excluded. On the other hand, we focus our energy on actually changing the structures and the systems that have excluded people. All of us in our day-to-day lives should be asking ourselves, how are we talking about the issues? Are we talking about it in ways that lead to charitable solutions? Or are we talking about these issues in ways that lead to structural change? On one hand, when we talk about problems where the community is vulnerable, we spend our time trying to fix the people. When we talk about the systems and the structures, we spend our time trying to fix those systems and those structures. So, moving to the next slide. All of this really does lead to how we tell stories. When we tell stories that are unfortunate, we talk about inequality, injustice, and racism almost like it's a car accident, like it sort of just happened. And when we talk about systems like that they're unjust, we end up actually talking about justice and structural issues. So there's a way in which we talk about the policing issues that Black communities face, and we talk about it like it just sort of happened. And there's another way we can talk about it, and we talk about how issues are manufactured, how choices have been made by government, how systems are structured and set up and are getting the results that they are designed to get. In each of these situations, we are making choices about the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that we tell the world. And as a result, the work that we end up doing to fix the problems that we're facing. Every single day at Color of Change, we're trying to face this head on. We're trying to face down the sort of ways in which these issues sort of impact people at a clear and structural level. And this gets down to whether or not we see racism as individual or structural. Can we go to the next slide? And so, what type of injustices do people see when they see a situation? We can see a situation as individual, or we can see a situation as systemic. When we see a situation as individual, we think about our role in compassion and empathy. And yes, many racist situations are individual. This is the instance of Ahmaud Arbery, who was tracked down in Georgia by white supremacists, and he was shot and killed. It was on video, and it was individual. Individuals had to do that action, but it was also structural. It was structural because for quite some time, those individuals that killed Ahmaud Arbery were let go free. They were not held accountable. The district attorneys in those jurisdictions decided that there wasn't sufficient evidence to charge, that with a lot of Black people that have been harmed and hurt on video, there was not going to be justice unless a community got involved. And think about how exhausting it is that every single time a situation hurts or harms your community, that you have to mobilize for some semblance of justice. That doesn't actually mean you have justice in the end. And so, yes, there's the individual action of a person believing that they can kill someone because of the color of their skin. And then there's a systemic situation in which a jurisdiction or a society believes that that life isn't worthy of fighting for or defending. And if I bring this down to sort of the ways in which we think about our own individual businesses or our day-to-day lives, there's the interpersonal of how we deal with racism, and then there's the structural of how we engage with racism. And so I will sometimes hear a lot of people talk about empathy and compassion. And those are incredibly important tools and vehicles. We should all work to be empathetic. We should all work to be compassionate. But I think the question that we all have to ask ourselves is, what does an empathetic society look like? What does a compassionate society look like? What does our empathetic business practices look like? What do our compassionate business practices look like? If we say we are empathetic and we say we are compassionate, but we are complicit every single day in systems and structures that are harming people, are we truly empathetic? Are we truly compassionate? Can we go to the next slide? And so I think it's really important that we all recognize that our decisions each and every day do not exist outside of the incentive structures that keep racism alive. They are products of them. Every single day, we are making decisions in our day-to-day work that is either breaking down racism and breaking down racist structures, or we are helping to keep them up. There is no neutrality when it comes to racism. We are either benefiting and holding it up, or we are actively working to tear it down. And I think 5, 10, 15 years from now, we can all look back on this time, this moment, what we did, how we stood up, what we sort of contributed to making society better. And we are going to have to ask ourselves, did we use the tools and resources at our disposal to challenge the systems and structures that put people in harm's way? Or were we complicit in holding them up? And then there are some things that we have to continue to ask ourselves in terms of our actions as part of that. Next slide. How will you allow yourself to be pushed? I think about this a lot. I think about this maybe because COVID has made the sort of personal training that kept me active and fit go away. I needed that personal training to push myself, to challenge myself, to move in ways that I may not move if I left up to my own devices. And so when we set up the tables in our businesses, when we set up the tables of advisors in our lives, who are we putting around those tables that will push us? How are we asking ourselves the tough questions about the decisions that we're making? Are we willing to have uncomfortable conversations and allow ourselves to be evaluated, not simply on the metrics that we hope people will see, but on the sort of things that people might not always tell us? How are those of us who have deep levels of power willing to put ourselves before communities to be able to question whether or not we are doing all that we can do? How are we allowing ourselves to be pushed? And if you are a person in power and you're not allowing yourself to be pushed on the ways in which change can happen, you are the person in the story that you don't want to be. You are not the protagonist in the story of creating a more just world for all of us. You are not the protagonist in the story of how we make society better for all of us. Next slide. And so I want to end by offering up Color of Change as a resource, as an organization that can continue to sort of engage, challenge, and work together in this fight to change the rules. The reason why we talk about the difference between presence and power is because this summer we had unprecedented growth. Millions of people came not only to Color of Change, but showed up to uprisings around the country. Many folks raised their voices and voter registration numbers went up. People turned out to vote. People recognized the role that we can all have if we come together to work together. But the fight ahead will be about removing the barriers that far too often pop up in the way anytime change can happen. And so all of us in this moment need to close our eyes and ask ourselves the question, when the movie, when the documentary, when the story is written about this moment, who will our character be? Who will we be? Who will we have fought for? What systems and structures will we have upheld? How will we use our power and our relative position to make a better world? We're all gonna want to be able to tell that positive story. But whatever you are doing right now, and whatever you wake up to do tomorrow in the service of a better tomorrow, will be the story that actually gets told about your service. It's such a pleasure to be with you all, and I hope that we can continue to work together to build a more just and more freedom-full world.
Thank you, Rashad. That was a really rousing talk. I was always wondering how we were going to get that same level of conviction that we have in our physical talks, but you did an excellent job. Thank you so much. I do have a few questions for you. When you and I first started talking a few months ago, we discussed how systemic racism and inequity are not issues confined to the United States. Over the weekend, I'm sure you saw French citizens were in the streets after a damning video emerged of 3 white police officers beating up a black music producer. We were just talking to David Lammy about systemic inequality and racism here in the UK. I mean, from your vantage point over in the US, what is your view of the way European countries are addressing these issues?
I had a lot of conversations with Europeans, especially this summer, about racism. I had many non-Black folks reach out to me and talk about the horrible things that were happening in the US, many of them talking about the unique way that racism exists. I had many Europeans tell me that sort of racism is not the same in Europe. And to the extent that racism is different in all places where racism exists, I can believe that. But I do think that folks sometimes want to tell themselves a story that they are not part of the same structures and systems which have upheld capitalism, which have upheld slavery, which have upheld all sorts of systemic oppression. And so, when I talk to Black folks in Europe, when I talk to many folks of color and religious minorities, they will tell me stories of the systemic nature of inequality, of the day-to-day individual abuse that they get, the exclusion, the lack of visibility in conversation, even for the issues. And so, in an increasingly connected world that's connected through technology, that's connected through commerce, none of us are off the matrix of this. And all of us have a role, once again, in either upholding these systems or tearing these systems down. And the fact of the matter is that United States is a land of, or a multiracial democracy, or a multiracial society of relative strangers, of people who have come from all different parts of the world and are trying to sort of make a way together. And that is challenging. And that exists all over the world. And where that exists, there will be hierarchies, there will be systems of oppression, and we cannot tear them down if we pretend they don't exist.
We've just been talking to Christopher Wiley and Roger McNamee about the growing power of technology giants. I'm curious, and actually you had someone, David Lammy was talking about cancel culture and using social media to take people down. What role does digital activism have to play in the battle for racial equity?
Well, we increasingly live not just in geographic communities, but virtual communities. They allow us to connect with people of like minds. They allow us to have engagements with people. And so sometimes you can be way more connected with your virtual community than you can be with the people who may live in your neighborhood. And that's going to be increasingly part of how society grows. The challenge that we have with the platforms, once again, speaks to the ways in which inequality develops, where it's not unfortunate like a car accident, it is manufactured, it is by design. And so these platforms, which have been built for growth and profit at the expense of safety, integrity, and security, constantly sort of have incentive structures which allow for the sort of most hateful content to travel, which allow for radicalization of some of the worst sort of ideas and the worst sort of strategies, the white nationalist movements, to be able to sort of gain steam. And so we see this on the platform. We've also been able to grow and reach more people, engage people through our activism. I mean, Color of Change started with a single email to about 1,000 people and has grown to a movement of 7.2 million Black folks and allies of every race. And just like the telephone or the TV or any other technology that has been used and leveraged in the service of activism, it can also be used and leveraged in the service of keeping people down. And so no technology, once again, is neutral. And both in the design, which is very important, and in the execution, we have to be vigilant about making sure that racial justice, that civil rights protections, that human rights protections are at the heart of how we think about these, so that folks who are religious minorities, gender minorities, racial minorities are not under attack by technology that is supposed to bring us into the future, but is in so many ways designed to drag us into a past.
Thank you so much, Rashad, for your time today. I really valued your contribution and hope to meet you in person someday soon.
Yeah.
All right. Sometimes we need to take the issues of systemic inequality into our own hands to get governments to change their policies. To discuss this, I'm pleased to introduce someone who just last week was named as one of the 100 most influential women in Britain by the BBC, no less. Have a look at this.
So what, we go Mackey's or Chicken Shop? The ultimate question amongst a group of friends going out. Ironic, because the two are variations of the same, both deep-fried junk, just under a different name. In a world full of choices, it seems we don't have many. Can't have nice food without spending a pretty penny. And that's the pretty price that many can't afford. We'd rather that 99p option on the billboard. Speaking of advertising, I really wonder why they use cartoons to catch my little sister's eye. Using kids to sell products, how can you justify sacrificing our health for your wealth? This has to be rectified. This isn't just one instance, it happens all over the scene. Young people's health is on the line, from London to Aberdeen. Whether it be supermarket shelves or school canteens, we deserve better. We cannot live by these means. It's about time the food industry put our well-being first. I don't want diabetes, obesity, or anything worse. It's frightening that junk food is our automatic reaction. When we're feeling hungry, this needs direct action. We're already worrying about racial justice and the Earth's condition, yet we still have to fight for a fairer food system.
Originally from Ethiopia, Christina Adane is 17 and lives in South London. And I'm delighted to welcome her here to the Voices studio today. A member of the Bite Back 2030 Youth Board, Christina recently began a crusade to see free school meals extended throughout the school holidays. Her goal was to end child hunger in England. The campaign gained further traction after being picked up by Manchester United footballer Marcus Rashford. And now over 430,000 people have signed her petition, which was an undeniable success. Because after initial resistance, the British government U-turned and announced a holiday provision for Easter, summer, and Christmas breaks next year. It was a huge victory for vulnerable children, some of whom rely on school food as the only healthy meal they eat each day. Christina Adane, welcome to the Voices 2020 studio.
Thank you for having me.
It's so nice to meet you in person, finally. Christina, you've become so passionate about nutrition and how it intersects with issues of health, race, social economics, and education. What does the food we eat say about the society we live in?
It says a lot, unfortunately. I have working class immigrant parents, and I grew up on free school meals, so did my friends, and I live in a food desert, which is essentially an area where there isn't much access to healthy, nutritious foods as much as there's access to unhealthy and very cheap foods. So I was completely oblivious to the fact that I was growing up in such an environment until I went to school in Westminster and I saw, you know, some more well-off kids having like salads and really green and nutritious foods every day. And then I joined Bite Back and I learned so much more. And it angers me. And once you when you deep dive into the food industry, it's so shocking to see how much food is a social indicator. I was doing work with Dr. Chris, and he's an amazing guy, but he told me that 70% of the food that young people eat at around my age is ultra-processed, which is just insane. So yeah, it's a shocking indicator.
We have viewers tuning in from all around the world. Everyone in the UK has heard of the Free School Meals campaign because it's been all over the news here. But for people who are maybe tuning in from elsewhere, can you just explain a little bit about what you were trying to achieve and how it all kind of happened?
Right, so I started a petition back in April this year. So it was like the 8th week of lockdown, and the thing that really motivated me to do it is the fact that we were in the midst of a global pandemic and families, they didn't have much money coming in, and parents are really stressed, having to take care of their kids 24/7 all the time. And for poorer families, that means having to provide food for your kids And if you don't have the money to do so, that's really stressful, right? And then the government suddenly took out the provisions for free school meals on the half term of May. And I was shocked. Everyone at Bite Back 2030 was shocked, because why would you do that? That's the most nonsensical thing. So I started the petition out of anger, essentially. And
where did you do the petition?
In my bedroom at home.
But like, did you use a website?
Oh, right, yeah, change.org. They've been amazing. They've been really supportive with it. And yeah, that's the go-to for petitions, definitely.
So how did it catch fire?
Well, I don't know. Like, I was just watching the petition over the days, and it was gaining so much traction. And I was so shocked, because I'd never heard people talk about free school meals before. I'd never heard people even think about, child health. So it was really the first time that someone had spoken about this. And I think that's why it was so, that's why it gained so much traction, because people had never heard about a young person that was on free school meals actually talk about it, because it's so stigmatized to be such a bad thing.
Got it. So for people who are watching, we have lots of people in the fashion industry. What can they do to get involved, to learn more about Bite Back 2030? And what are the goals of the organization kind of beyond the specific situation we find ourselves in now?
So the fashion industry is one of the most influential and creative industries in the world, right? And I think that they can do so much to help young people find creative solutions to the problems that we have in the world. So Bite Back 2030 is a campaign that tries to help end child obesity by 2030, so half the statistics. And we fight the injustices of the food industry. So I've done that with the Free School Meals campaign. We're going to do that with a junk food ad campaign that we're going to launch. And it's completely led by young people. So I'm one of 100 now, 120 young people, and I'm the co-chair of the youth board. And we've literally got so many young people that are ready to work with and collaborate with the fashion industry and loads of other industries that help to essentially end the injustices that we see amongst the food industry, but also elsewhere.
I was thinking about your campaign, and it occurred to me that this is the kind of campaign that could be easily replicated around the world, because as we've been discussing, for the last hour or so at Voices, systemic inequality is everywhere. Have you thought about taking this campaign and some of the initiatives and actions on a global basis? I'm sure there's other like-minded young women like you around the world who could equally play a part in their own societies and countries.
Definitely. Global is a big word. I've definitely, over lockdown, I've been able to talk to some amazing people. I have a friend in Greece who's a climate activist, and we do a lot on intersectionality. I've been able to learn a lot more about the climate refugee crisis, and she's learned a lot more about the food industry and how terrible it can be. And so we are making those links. And I think what's so great about social media, as Rashad said earlier, it can really connect people and get people to fight for something more connectedly. So definitely, I mean, the goal is, by the end of my lifetime, to see food poverty just eradicated completely, wherever you are in the world. So yeah.
Okay. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask about Marcus Rashford. How did he actually pick up on your campaign, and have you had a chance to meet him or talk to him yet?
I have no idea, honestly. I think, because I remember the first half term, we had won completely by ourselves, and that made the news a lot. I was suddenly on BBC and ITV, and I was so shocked.
And now
so he
you're
probably,
on VOS.
Exactly. So he probably clocked it from there.
Yeah.
And obviously he's taken it to new heights. But no, I haven't had any direct contact with him. But Bite Back and his team have. But yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll have to make sure that you and Marcus get to meet each other someday.
Definitely.
Because you clearly both played such a pivotal role in this campaign, and I want to congratulate you on the work you've done. It's so admirable to see young people taking these issues of systemic inequity into their own hands. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming to the Voices studio today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Now, from a guest at the start of her career to one with a lifetime of experience. Our next speaker is the noted Schumpeterian and academic rock star, 81-year-old Carlota Perez. Indeed, one of my favorite economic theories from university is Joseph Schumpeter's principle of how creative destruction is a natural part of the business cycle, or a process of industrial mutation that continuously revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one. Carlota's book, Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital, is quite literally the go-to Bible for many of the world's leading technology thinkers. But today, we're very fortunate to hear from the original source. But first, here's a short video that explains the core elements of Carlota's thinking on the new green global age of the information revolution.
Capitalism reinvents itself every 40 to 70 years. Each reinvention brings a new common sense together with a new set of all-pervasive technologies. That common sense determines how we produce, consume, and organize our institutions. There have been 5 technological revolutions. The first one, the Industrial Revolution in late 18th century Britain, built canals for cheap and easy transport and introduced machinery and factories. 6 decades later, the age of steam, coal, iron, and railways began in Britain too. From the 1870s, the age of steel and heavy engineering saw Britain, the US, and Germany competing for leadership. It was the first globalization. And in early 20th century, the age of the automobile, oil, petrochemicals, and mass production began in the United States. Our current age of information and communications technology started in the 1970s, also in the US, in Silicon Valley. Each technological revolution begins in one or a few sectors in some corner of the world, and from there spreads to encompass most of human activity. The new technologies appear and come together when the industries of the previous revolution are mature and declining. Those uncertain new technologies need risk finance to develop. The initial successes bring a frenzy of investment that ends in major financial bubbles. Their inevitable collapses bring recessions and social unrest. Those who lost their jobs and skills are resentful and tend to follow emerging populist leaders. In order to achieve social well-being for all, we need to recognize the failure of the dominant practices, which are now obsolete, and also to identify the potential of the new technologies for creating new and better ones in both the public and the private sphere. Since the microprocessor first appeared, and after the culmination of intense market experimentation with hardware, software, and organizations, we are in the aftermath of major bubbles and in the middle of a systemic crisis. The world is at the turning point, and we need to reap the full benefits of the digital revolution. In doing so, we must create the new fabric of the economy and the new social safety net. It is up to us to envision what the economy will look like and how society will benefit. Let's bring forth the green global golden age of the information revolution.
In our final talk for the wider world at Voices 2020, I'm pleased to welcome Carlota Perez to discuss the green global age of the information revolution. So Carlota, why don't you start by telling us what the green global age of the information revolution is?
I will definitely do that, Imran, after thanking you for inviting me and saying how wonderful and also very difficult it is to close this session with such brilliant presenters, which are both lifting our spirits, but also worrying us. I hope that my message is a message of hope and optimism. And it's not just because I want to be optimistic, but because I've spent most of my life studying history, the history of technological revolutions, and we have come out of such terrible times before. So that's what gives me my optimism. So as I suggested in the video history, we can shape the information revolution into a green global golden age. I guess you will ask what it means. What is this? What does it take to shape this thing? Well, first of all, we have to understand that the future has to be green so that it can be sustainable. We already know that the planet cannot take the way we've been living, especially not if we incorporate everybody, which is our hope. So what is this thing about? Well, first of all, it's a cultural change. We start by understanding that the planet is no longer an inexhaustible source of materials and energy and everything we want. We have begun to understand its fragility, its vulnerability. We live in a vulnerable planet. We have to take care of it. Waste has to become a source of shame. And our imagination needs to turn to ways of avoiding it. No more waste. Pride in reusing, in redesigning, in recycling, in using renewable things. Energy is not to be taken for granted. We're beginning to see conservation as the way to use it, and renewable sources as the accepted way of providing it. So these are the things that have to do with a shift in our culture. But we also have to change our aspirations. We need to change our lifestyle completely. And by the way, it has happened every time. The Victorian boom, the Belle Epoque, the post-war boom. The post-war boom, of course, was the one that created this mess that we're in now, because the mass production and the mass consumption revolution is the one that has made the planet into this problem. But we can change again. We've done it each time. What we need to do is to reimagine the good life and to have a different set of aspirations. What's happiness about? It's certainly not about maximum possessions, but about access to well-being. What's well-being? Well, many things, but basically lots of collaboration, sharing, and then in terms of how we access the things we need, rental, maintenance, all these ways, which are new ways, which we have to learn. Pleasure, what's pleasure? Well, it doesn't necessarily come from having lots of things. It comes from knowledge, from health, from creativity, from experiences, from communication with others, from discovery, and so on. All these wonderful things. And of course, comfort, but a comfort that's not based on waste, but based on being able to use again and again and having truly durable products. With our technologies, we should be able to make products that last 80 years, and we can. But planned obsolescence has made it that we need to throw away, buy new, throw away. So that's not possible anymore. We've got to find the new sources of pleasure that have not to do with wasting and with much. How about capital? How are we wealthy? Well, the most valuable capital we can possess is knowledge, experience, capabilities. Therefore, lifelong learning becomes an expectation for increasing well-being. So that's what it means for us all personally. What does this mean for the fashion industry? Well, it means a complete reinvention. It's up to you to reinvent what we understand by fashion. It's up to you to reinvent how we dress and when. It's up to you to rethink, reinvent, redesign. But sustainability is not enough. The future must also be global. And I'll tell you that, of course, we all want global development. We don't do much about it, do we? But the thing is that it's important for the advanced countries for both generous and selfish reasons. The generous reason is the obvious humanitarian one. Okay, everybody would like that to happen. But now we have another reason. We have selfish reasons, two big selfish reasons. One is that if every country were to develop, now that Asia is practically the place where all consumer goods, all the massive consumer goods are produced, we have lost all those jobs because they're over there and they're cheaper and they're not coming back. And if they come back with robotics. So what is it that development would create markets for? It would create markets for equipment, for engineering. Equipment would have to be redesigned for sustainability, for climate, for scale, and that would create lots of jobs in the advanced world, together with all the jobs that we could create by maintenance and making goods, making a rental economy. So those are two big sources of jobs that we could have, but particularly having markets in the developing world, every single country needing these things and redesigning them in such a way that the planet can sustain them. It's also markets for education, markets even for luxury goods, because when countries develop, of course, they will have layers of different layers and different types of goods that they will require, more and more countries developing. But also another thing, which they would, if all the countries were to develop, then migrations would be reduced because you reduce the desperation at home. Most people prefer to be in their country. They have their friends and their family. People go through all those risks because it's so horrible behind them that it might as well be horrible on the way to this wonderful haven and heaven that are these advanced countries. So, and then those countries from which these people migrate lose those brains, lose that courage, lose all that value, precisely because they have nothing to offer. So again, this would be good for everybody. Now, there is a lot of talk about deglobalization. We heard about it today. But the thing is that I don't really think that what we need is deglobalization. What we need is reshaping globalization. Up to now, it's been just chasing low cost. It has been concentrated in China or Asia, but it needs to be spread more evenly across the world, and it needs to be rethought, respecialization of every single country. In fact, every country has to start thinking of industrial policy. Yes, we've got to go back to industrial policy. This crazy free market thing, that's what has brought us to where we are now. So we need to work together, a win-win game between the state and business. And that's what we have had. Every golden age has been a win-win game with government staging the game and business benefiting from it, but the whole of society benefiting and not just the few, the 1% that's getting everything. So what other thing do we need this golden age? I mean, what else do we need to get this golden age to function as such? Well, we need to embrace and shape the information revolution. We have to be smart in its use. We need to turn products into services. We've already done it with films, with music and books. We might do it with access to automobiles eventually. We need many, many changes in the way we fulfill our needs. And the information technologies are intangible. They tend naturally to reduce the amount of materials we need to to enjoy whatever or to have whatever comforts. Of course, we need chairs and tables and beds and we're not going to disappear them, but we could have them rented in some cases. In fact, that's a long story, but it could even be that we stop thinking that we need to own our houses. We could buy the right to have a house and mobilize and go to houses, but that's a long story that I won't go into now. But we need to use ICT to minimize pollution and waste. We need it to enable effective and personalized healthcare. There is so much that information technology can do to improve our healthcare knowledge and our healthcare services. We need preventive medicine. We need all sorts of things where information technology can help. We need it to enrich education. We need to stop, we already learned now that it can be done, that you can do it. But that means everybody has got to have internet. We need universal access to internet at prices that are possible for everybody. And of course, to also strengthen communities through all sorts of other communications. Now, why can I be sure that it can be a golden age? Well, for both environmental and social sustainability. Every technological revolution, as you saw in the film, goes through times of inequality and times of wider social well-being, forced by social pressure, of course. The politicians understand that they have to. All this populism all over the world, all these leaders who get all the resentment of people out and all this thing, that's all because what we have done in the past, actually 40 years, is to make the poor poorer and the rich richer. And that's not possible. You can't have, it's not legitimate for the system to do that. So what we need is two components. Every golden age has two components. One is what I just told you about government action to create a win-win game between business and society. And the other one, the one that's implied in everything I've said, is a change in lifestyles, because that's what provides the demand that shapes innovation and investment. That's what provides the demand that tells you which way to go, in which direction to innovate. And both of these depend on social behavior and social pressure. So it is up to us in our lives and in our work, in our political actions and our communications, to move the world in the best possible direction, a smart, green, and global golden age. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlota. I could see from all the comments coming through that your words have been very inspiring from our viewers. And I have a lot of questions that have come in from around the world that I want to kind of take you through. The first, there's a couple of questions here. One is from Eileen in the USA. There's a similar question from Javi Contreras in Chile. They're both asking about, as technology threatens to replace jobs in different industries, making manufacturing cheaper, how do we take care of these communities that are going to be left without jobs because of AI and other, robotics, etc.?
Okay, that has two sorts of answers. One has to do with whether we can do away with those technologies or if it's important to have them. Well, the answer is it's very important to have them. And the reason why it's so important is a very simple reason. We need to produce more wealth, enough wealth to make, precisely to lift the poor up, to lift all the ones from the bottom up. Of course, you need to give them jobs. So the issue is that with every technological revolution, one part of the economy uses these very high-tech things, which have very high productivity. And the rest of the economy develops all sorts of new things that very often are related to the change in lifestyles. If we look, for instance, at what happened in the US in the post-war golden age, what they had was barely 30% of workers were in the mass production industries, the high tech, well, we don't see it as high tech now, but it was very high tech when they were making cars and airplanes and all that at the time. So the people who were working in that were very highly productive. The people who were working in all the things that the suburban life required, all the American way of life required a lot of services, retail, banks, this, restaurants, cafes, all those things, and mortgages, and all construction, of course, a lot. All those things created the jobs, and government created lots of other jobs too. So in the end, the final result was that this extra wealth created by the very highly productive things and these extra jobs created by those other needs came together, and the salaries did not really represent big differences, but much less. It's only now that we have that problem, and that is typical of these periods. So that's my first answer, a bit long. I'll give you a second answer, which is that we need to discover what each area of the world, what each area of each country can do, and relive the whole, reinvent, but with consensus, not just government deciding, but working together with business to reconceptualize each bit of territory, each city, each community. We need local government to be much stronger so we can do this. And for the Chilean one who made the question, please go to my webpage. There are lots of articles about what to do in Latin America, including your country in particular.
Okay, I have one more question here, Carlota, from Amin Abdel Wahab in Bahrain. And he says, as you highlighted, waste is a major issue in today's age. How do you think the fashion industry should and can combat the issue and not use it as a strategic tool? And I think many people are referring to companies like H&M and others that are sitting on mountains of unsold inventory and then have no way of disposing of that inventory.
Yes, well, the first thing they could do, no, I don't really know what they could do. I just thought of something, but maybe if you actually clothe people who don't have clothing all over the world, which would be very nice, then you ruin the companies that are in those countries. So it's a complex problem. Maybe they have to work together. I don't know. But definitely we have to reinvent the clothing industry, the whole, what do we do? It could be better to have very high quality, long-lasting things that could actually be used and reused and redesigned and other people. So rethink completely what we do, design very expensive things at the top to be bought by some people, and then come down, without meaning that you have to change 4 times a year, throw out your clothes, 6 washes only. That has got to end. You've got to, I mean, I cannot solve the problem of many industries that will suffer, but I can certainly tell you that if you put your brilliant heads to solving this problem and making money along the way, you'll succeed. But you've got to recognize the obstacles. If you deny it, you're going to die. And you can't die. We need you.
Okay. Well, that was a really great way to end today's session. Thank you so much for your time, Carlota. It's been lovely getting to know you via Zoom over these past few months, and wonderful to talk to you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Well, that brings us to the end of our first session on the wider world at Voices 2020. Tomorrow's programming will begin at 2 p.m. London time, that's 9 a.m. in New York, with the unveiling of our annual report on the State of Fashion 2021. That will be followed by other sessions jam-packed with inspirational leaders and thinkers. For Inside the Fashion System, we'll consider the changes we need to make as an industry, reimagine what's possible, and look at the exciting opportunities this could bring. And in Technology and Innovation, we'll explore how new technologies are changing consumer behavior and how they're opening up new growth and avenues for fashion companies around the world. A quick reminder to those of you who hold a Voices Executive Pass, our Connect and Think Big networking sessions will start in 15 minutes. These will give you a chance to get to know some of your fellow attendees in small curated groups. So be sure to join by clicking on the agenda page of the Voices website. And for everyone else, for all our BOF professionals, we look forward to seeing you at the same time, the same place tomorrow for day 2 of Voices 2020. That's all from me from here in London at our Voices studio. We'll see you all tomorrow.